The first time I saw the photograph, it wasn't in an album or a frame. It was floating in a puddle. It had been raining all morning. One of those relentless drizzles that soaks into your clothes and makes the whole world feel soggy. I'd been walking to the corner store, cursing myself for forgetting an umbrella, when something small and white caught my eye near the curb. It looked like trash at first, a torn piece of paper, maybe, but when I stooped down, I saw it was a photograph, waterlogged and curling at the edges. The image was faded, but I could make out 3 people standing in front of a carnival ride. A Ferris wheel loomed in the background, its lights blurred like smudged stars. The figures were smiling, though their faces were slightly distorted by the water damage. 2 adults, a man and a woman, and a little girl in between them, holding a red balloon. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe it was the balloon. Something about its bright, defiant red against the gray wash of the photo made it feel like it didn't belong, like it had been preserved for a reason. I tucked it into my coat pocket and forgot about it until later that evening, when I pulled it out and laid it on the kitchen counter to dry. That's when the photo changed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The faces seemed sharper, more distinct, like they'd been drawn into focus while the rest of the photo remained fuzzy. The little girl looked up at me with wide, solemn eyes, the kind that made you feel like she knew something you didn't. I couldn't stop staring at it. That night, I dreamed about the carnival. I was standing at the entrance, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and spun sugar. The lights of the rides blinked in time to a distant, tinny calliope tune, and the crowd moved around me in slow motion, their laughter warped and strange. The little girl was there, clutching her red balloon. She stood just out of reach, watching me with those same wide eyes. When I woke up, the photo was on my bedside table. I knew for a fact I'd left it in the kitchen. I stared at it, my heart pounding, and then something caught my eye. The Ferris wheel in the background. It was spinning now, slowly, but unmistakably. The tiny lights dotting its frame blinked on and off, and the cars swung gently as if rocked by an invisible wind. I told myself it couldn't be real. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe the rainwater had warped the ink in some bizarre way. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The photograph was alive. The next night, the dreams got worse. This time, I was inside the carnival. The little girl was leading me through the maze of rides and stalls, her balloon bobbing behind her like a loyal pet. She didn't speak, but I could hear her laughter echoing, sharp and high like a bird's call. She led me to the Ferris wheel. It wasn't like the Ferris wheels I'd seen before. This one was massive, its spokes made of twisted metal that seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly with a dull red glow. The cars weren't cars, they were cages, swinging ominously as the wheel turned. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The little girl turned to look at me, her face suddenly pale and hollow. "You have to get on," she whispered. I woke up screaming. When I stumbled into the kitchen, gasping for air, I found the photo waiting for me on the table. The little girl was gone. The red balloon, too. The Ferris wheel had stopped moving, but one of the cages was now open, its doors swinging wide. I didn't sleep after that. I spent the next day trying to get rid of the photograph. I tore it in half, and then into quarters, but the pieces just reassembled themselves, the edges stitching back together like a wound. I burned it, and for a moment, I thought it was gone, until I opened my fridge and found it sitting neatly on the top shelf, untouched. I even tried burying it in the backyard. But when I went back inside, it was already waiting for me, propped up against the TV like a framed family photo. The worst part was that the image kept changing. The 2 adults in the photo, who I'd barely noticed before, were growing clearer, their smiles sharper, almost menacing. And there was something else now, just barely visible in the shadows behind them. A figure, tall and thin, with long fingers that gripped the edge of the frame like it was trying to climb out. I knew then that the photo wasn't just alive. It was hungry. It wanted me. The next time I dreamed, I was already on the Ferris wheel. The cage door clanged shut behind me, locking me in. The little girl's laughter echoed from somewhere far below as the wheel began to turn. Slow at first, then faster and faster still. The world spun around me, a blur of lights and screams, until everything went dark. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. The photograph was gone. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I told myself it was over, that whatever it was had finally let me go. But then I noticed something on my bedside table. A red balloon, and it was starting to deflate. I'd been walking down a quiet street on my way to the cafe where we were meeting when I spotted them. Tiny, warm lights strung through the trees along the sidewalk, their glow casting a soft, magical haze over the pavement. I almost walked past them, distracted by the chill in the air and my nerves about meeting him. But then I noticed something strange. The lights weren't just decorative. They were leading somewhere. A piece of string was tied to the base of the first tree, attached to a little note dangling just low enough to catch my eye. Follow the lights. Don't peek at your phone for directions. Trust me. I laughed out loud, instantly recognizing his humor. He'd told me during our first conversation that he had a creative streak, but I hadn't expected this. Intrigued, I stuffed my phone into my pocket and followed the path of lights. They stretched along the street, winding through lampposts, leading me through alleys I'd never noticed before. Each string ended at a new little note. One said, "Almost there." "Yes, this is ridiculous." Another read, "I promise this doesn't end with me making you solve a murder mystery." Eventually, the lights stopped at a nondescript red door. Another note was taped to the handle. "Knock 3 times. Wait exactly 5 seconds. This is very important." Rolling my eyes but grinning the entire time, I knocked. 1, 2, 3. 5 seconds later, the door swung open, and there he was, holding 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate and looking incredibly pleased with himself. "Hey," he said, his grin so wide I couldn't help but laugh. "You made it. What is this?" I asked, stepping inside. "This," he said, gesturing grandly, "is my favorite little secret." The space was enchanting. It wasn't a restaurant or a bar or anything else I'd expected. Instead, it was a hidden courtyard, surrounded by old brick walls covered in ivy, with tiny lights twinkling overhead like stars. There was a single table in the center, set with mismatched chairs and a small candle flickering in the middle. It felt like a scene from a dream, or maybe the beginning of one of those indie romance movies that always made me cry. "Okay," I said, folding my arms and trying to look serious. "Explain." He handed me one of the mugs, his smile softening. "I found this place a couple of years ago. It used to be part of a cafe that closed down, but no one ever did anything with the courtyard. It just sat here, empty. One night, I wandered in with a book, and it kind of became my escape, my spot." He scratched the back of his neck, suddenly looking a little shy. I figured, if I'm lucky enough to have a spot like this, why not share it? So, here we are. I took a sip of the hot chocolate, which was rich and sweet and exactly what I needed in the crisp evening air. "You're lucky I didn't call this off," I teased. "What if I'd thought the string lights were some kind of weird trap?" He raised an eyebrow. "Would have been an epic story either way." We sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed like we'd been doing this for years. He told me about how he'd always been drawn to forgotten places, abandoned libraries, overgrown gardens, train stations at odd hours of the night. "There's something kind of beautiful about them," he said, "like they're waiting for someone to notice them again." I told him about how I'd always wanted to write, but never quite found the courage to put my words out into the world. "Maybe they don't need to be perfect," he said. "Maybe they just need to be noticed." Somewhere between sharing stories about the weirdest places we'd ever been and debating the best toppings for hot chocolate, he was firmly team marshmallows, while I argued for whipped cream. I realized something strange. I wasn't nervous anymore. This didn't feel like a date. It felt like an adventure I hadn't realized I needed. At one point, he stood up and disappeared into the shadows, returning a moment later with a battered notebook. "I almost forgot," he said, flipping it open. "This is for you." "For me?" "Well, kind of. It's for us." He handed me the notebook, and I saw that the first page was already filled with messy, looping handwriting. Rules of the notebook. 1. We can only write ridiculous things. 2. No judging each other's ridiculousness. 3. Every adventure gets at least 1 page. I looked up at him, both amused and touched. "You're starting this on the first date?" Technically the second, he said, winking. Trivia night was the first. Besides, I'm an optimist. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, stories, and scribbled nonsense in that notebook. We invented a secret society of time travelers whose mission was to save historical recipes from extinction. We designed a theme park where every ride was based on childhood fears. At some point, he took a Polaroid camera out of his bag and snapped a picture of me mid-laugh, saying, "Every notebook needs a cover photo." When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car, the night quiet except for the soft crunch of our footsteps. "So," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets, "was this better or worse than a regular dinner date?" "Better," I said, smiling. "But now you've set the bar unreasonably high." "Good," he said, his grin returning, "because next time, we're finding an abandoned train station." I laughed, shaking my head. "Deal, but only if we bring more hot chocolate." He nodded solemnly. Obviously. When I got home that night, I pulled the notebook out of my bag. On the last page, he'd written something I hadn't noticed before. "Every good story starts with a little light in the dark. Tonight, ours started with string lights." What's next? I didn't have an answer then, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't wait to find out. Have you ever had a date that felt like stepping into another world? One you didn't want to leave? The moon hung low, red as a fresh wound, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned carnival. Tess pulled her jacket tighter, the chill of the night biting through the fabric. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked asphalt as she walked past rows of rusting rides and faded signs. The air smelled faintly of mildew and burnt sugar, a memory preserved in decay. This place had been closed for over 20 years, and yet tonight, it wasn't empty. The Ferris wheel creaked in the wind, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the bleeding sky. Somewhere deeper in the park, faint music played, a lilting, warped tune that sounded like it was being dragged through a nightmare. Tess hesitated at the entrance to the funhouse, its grinning clown face painted in chipped, garish colors. The message had been clear: midnight. Funhouse. Come alone. She didn't know why she'd come. She wasn't even sure if she believed the email that had popped into her inbox 3 nights ago. The subject line had been her brother's name, Evan. The message contained only 4 words: he's alive. Come alone. Beneath it were coordinates leading to the carnival. It didn't make sense. Evan had been dead for 5 years. She had seen his body, pale and still, surrounded by doctors who couldn't meet her eyes. She had been at his funeral, watched the casket lowered into the ground. There had been no doubt, and yet here she was. The funhouse doors creaked as she pushed them open, the sound sharp and grating in the stillness. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with dust and the faint, cloying smell of rot. The mirrors that lined the entrance hall were cracked and clouded, their reflections warped. Tessa's own image stared back at her, stretched and fragmented, her face a distorted mask. She moved deeper inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Evan," she called, her voice shaky. It sounded strange in the funhouse, swallowed and echoed in ways that didn't make sense. The warped music grew louder, discordant notes grinding against her nerves. She stopped at a fork in the path, where 2 hallways led off in opposite directions. The left corridor was dark, its mirrors smashed entirely. The right glowed faintly with flickering neon lights that buzzed like flies. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the funhouse itself were alive and breathing. She chose the right hallway, the light casting her shadow long and wavering on the floor. Each step felt like a decision she couldn't take back. "Keep going," a voice whispered from the walls, soft and scratchy, like a recording played at the wrong speed. She froze, her breath hitching. "Evan?" she asked again, louder this time. The voice didn't answer. A mirror ahead shimmered, the faint outline of a figure appearing within its fractured surface. Tess moved closer, her pulse racing. The figure resolved slowly, like smoke condensing into a shape. It was a boy. No, a man now, thin, with messy dark hair and eyes that looked as hollow as her brother's had in the casket. Her breath caught. "Evan," she whispered. The figure in the mirror smiled faintly, sadly. "You shouldn't have come." Her knees felt weak, and she reached out to steady herself against the mirror's frame. "It's you," she said, her voice cracking. I thought you were dead. We buried you. Evan, what is this? What's happening?" "I tried to stay away," he said, his voice muffled and distant, as if coming from underwater. "But I didn't have a choice." "I don't understand." Tess pressed her palm against the glass, the surface icy cold. "Where are you? How is this possible?" Before he could answer, the air in the funhouse changed. A low hum vibrated through the walls, and the mirrors began to ripple like water. Evan's face twisted, his expression contorted by fear. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent now. "Tess, go. Right now." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you. Not again." "You don't understand," he said, his reflection growing dimmer. "They're coming. If you stay, they'll take you too." "Who?" she demanded. "Evan, tell me what's going on." The mirrors exploded. The shards didn't fall. They hung in the air, suspended like jagged stars, catching and refracting the flickering neon light. Tess ducked instinctively, shielding her face, but the shards didn't move toward her. They swirled in the air, spinning faster and faster, until they coalesced into something she couldn't describe. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It shimmered, its body a fractured mosaic of mirror and light, constantly shifting and rearranging itself. Tess stared at it, frozen by its impossible beauty and terror. "Leave," Evan's voice came again, but it wasn't coming from the mirrors now. It was in her head, clear and desperate. "Run, Tess. Now." The creature lunged. Tess barely dodged in time, the thing crashing into the wall where she had stood moments before. The impact sent a shockwave through the funhouse, the warped music rising to a frenzied pitch. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the creature's movements a blur of light and razor edges behind her. The path twisted and turned, the mirrors lining the walls reflecting 1,000 different versions of her panic-stricken face. She couldn't tell which way she was going, only that she had to keep moving. "Left," Evan's voice shouted in her head. "Turn left." She obeyed without question, veering into a narrow corridor just as the creature slashed at the air where she had been. She could feel the heat of it behind her, the sharp hum of its energy making her skin prickle. The exit was ahead, the grinning clown mouth growing larger with every step. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs threatening to give out. "Jump!" Evan shouted. She didn't think. She dove forward, hitting the ground just as the creature lunged again. It collided with the doorframe, the impact sending a cascade of sparks and shards flying in all directions. Tess scrambled to her feet, sprinting into the open air. The creature didn't follow. It hovered at the threshold of the funhouse, its form shimmering and unstable. For a moment, it looked almost human, a figure of light and glass with eyes that glowed like dying stars. Then it turned and vanished into the shadows. Tess collapsed onto the cold ground, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The carnival around her was silent now, the warped music gone, the rides still as tombstones. She stared at the funhouse, her mind reeling. "I told you to leave," Evan's voice said behind her. She turned sharply, and there he was, not in the mirrors, but standing before her, real and solid and impossibly alive. His eyes were tired, his face lined with shadows, but it was him. "Evan," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. You shouldn't have come," he interrupted, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You've seen too much now. They won't stop." "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What was that thing? What's happening?" Evan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer and placed something cold and smooth into her hand. She looked down to see a shard of mirror, its edges glinting faintly in the moonlight. "Keep this," he said. "You'll need it." Before she could ask what he meant, the ground beneath her began to rumble. The carnival lights flickered back on, but they were no longer warm and welcoming. They were sharp, searing, casting long, unnatural shadows. Evan stepped back, his face unreadable. "Run, Tess," he said, "and don't stop." She looked at him one last time. the brother she had lost and somehow found again, before the rumbling grew louder and the lights began to pulse. She turned and ran, the shard of mirror clutched tightly in her hand, the air around her crackling with the sound of something ancient and hungry awakening behind her. It began with the rain, though not the kind you'd expect. Not the dramatic, movie-perfect downpour or a storm that crashes through the sky like an argument. No, this rain was soft and steady, a whisper against the windows that blended into the quiet hum of my Sunday afternoon. I had been cleaning out the closet in my hallway, one of those tasks you start on a whim and immediately regret halfway through when everything you've ever owned is suddenly spread out on the floor. That's when I found it. A shoebox, buried under a pile of old scarves and mismatched mittens, its cardboard edges soft with age. It wasn't labeled, and for a moment, I had no memory of what it might hold. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, tugging off the lid, and the smell hit me first. A faint, warm musk of paper, dust, and something else. Plastic, maybe? Like the scent of an old toy left in the attic too long. Inside, I found an assortment of small treasures, crumpled ticket stubs, Polaroids with soft edges, a handful of cheap friendship bracelets tangled together like a rainbow-colored spiderweb, and at the very bottom, tucked beneath a folded flyer for a county fair, was the Viewmaster. I hadn't thought about it in years, but the second I saw it, I felt an electric jolt of recognition, like bumping into a childhood friend you'd forgotten existed. Its red plastic frame was a little scuffed, the lever on the side still intact. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. And there they were, the reels, stacked in the corner of the box like tiny paper records. I held one up to the light and read the label, Safari Adventure. Without thinking, I slipped it into the slot, lifted the Viewmaster to my eyes, and clicked the lever. The first image snapped into focus, a lion, stretched out in a sunlit savanna. But what struck me wasn't the picture itself. It was the rush of memory that came with it, pulling me under like a wave. Suddenly, I was 7 years old, sprawled on the carpet of my grandparents' living room. My grandpa had just handed me the Viewmaster, grinning as if he'd unlocked the secrets of the universe. "It's not a toy," he said in his gruff but loving way. "It's a portal." He wasn't wrong. I remember clicking through the reels with the kind of awe that only kids can muster, gasping at the scenes. Giraffes grazing under a pink-orange sunset, an elephant wading through a watering hole, the shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro in the background. The world had felt so impossibly big back then, like I could step into the pictures if I just squinted hard enough. My grandparents' house was small and cluttered, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of vanilla candles. I can still hear the creak of the old rocking chair where my grandma sat, knitting quietly while I narrated the stories I invented for the pictures. "This lion is the king," I'd announce, holding the Viewmaster up dramatically. "And he's protecting the watering hole from poachers." Grandpa would nod solemnly, playing along as though I'd just delivered the evening news. The Viewmaster wasn't just a toy to me. It was a time machine, a doorway, a spark. Even now, I remember how it felt to click that lever and feel like the world unfolded just for me, one frame at a time. I clicked the lever again, and the lion disappeared. Now it was a zebra, mid-stride across a grassy plain. I laughed softly, half at the image and half at the way the memory tugged at my chest. It was funny, wasn't it? How things that once felt larger than life could shrink and fade over time, slipping into the corners of your mind until you almost forget they were ever there? I couldn't even remember the last time I'd visited my grandparents' house, or if it was still standing. They'd passed away years ago, leaving behind their patchwork of stories and knickknacks. But here, in my hands, was this tiny relic of our shared world. For the rest of the afternoon, I sat on the floor, sifting through the reels. Some of them were new adventures I'd forgotten about. Space exploration, underwater reefs, scenes from fairy tales. Each one brought a different flicker of memory, a collage of moments that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly close. I thought about how many times I'd clicked through those same reels, my tiny fingers sticky with peanut butter from the sandwiches my grandma made. I could hear her laugh, soft and musical, and the low rumble of my grandpa's voice as he made up ridiculous animal facts just to see if I'd catch him. Giraffes only sleep upside down, he'd say with a twinkle in his eye. Everybody knows that. Eventually, the rain outside faded into a gentle drizzle, the kind that makes the air smell fresh and alive. I stood up, stretching my legs, the Viewmaster still clutched in my hand. It was just a toy, just a simple plastic thing. But in that moment, it felt like so much more. It felt like holding an entire lifetime, pressed into a few paper reels and a series of small, perfect images. I put the Viewmaster back in the box, but I didn't put the box away. Not yet. Instead, I left it on the shelf by my bed, where it could sit as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the past isn't gone. It's just waiting quietly, tucked away in the forgotten corners of our lives, until we're ready to find it again. What about you? Have you ever stumbled across something small and unexpected that transported you back? Something that made you feel, even for a moment, like you were holding your younger self in your hands? I'd love to hear what it was, and where it took you. The moment I realized the world had officially gone off the rails was when my toaster asked me to rate its performance. It wasn't just a beep or a polite flashing light. No, this was a full-blown message on the tiny digital screen that read, "How would you rate this toast?" Smiley face. The smiley face added a level of emotional manipulation I wasn't ready for at 8 a.m. It's toast. What was I supposed to say? Great job, buddy. You really nailed that golden brown glow? I hesitated for a moment, then tapped the little star icon next to the message. 5 stars. Not because the toast was exceptional, it was toast, but because the thought of disappointing my toaster felt weirdly personal. And that's how my day started, coddling a machine that can't even feel shame. I took my toast to the table, opened my laptop, and was immediately bombarded by notifications. My email was hosting a digital circus, flashy subject lines like, "You won't believe this offer," or "Last chance to save 5% on socks," while my to-do list app chimed in with reminders like, "Call dentist," "Overdue," as if I needed my phone to nag me like a disapproving parent. But the real kicker came when I got an alert from my bank. It wasn't about my balance or a suspicious charge. No, it was a cheerful message that said, "You spent $23 on coffee this week. Treat yourself wisely." A bank giving me life advice. I stared at it, clutching my cup of overpriced caramel macchiato, and muttered, "How about you stay in your lane, Wells Fargo?" As I worked through my morning emails, translation, deleting everything except receipts and memes, I noticed something strange happening in the corner of my screen. A tiny pixelated dog appeared. No warning, no explanation. It barked once, wagged its tail, and then trotted across my desktop. I blinked, half convinced I was hallucinating. But there it was, a digital puppy, now sitting in the corner, staring at me expectantly. "Okay," I whispered, leaning in like I was about to interrogate it. "What are you?" The dog didn't answer, obviously, but a message popped up above its head. "Hi, I'm Pixel. Let's tackle your tasks together." It was part of some productivity software I'd accidentally installed, and now I had a pixelated cheerleader offering to help me stay focused. At first, I found it annoying, but by the third time it wagged its tail, I was genuinely rooting for Pixel. "All right, Pixel," I said, opening my to-do list. "Let's crush some goals." By lunchtime, things had taken another bizarre turn. I decided to order food because cooking sounded like a personal attack on my free time. The delivery app asked me not just what I wanted to eat, but how I was feeling today. The options included things like adventurous, comforting, and surprise me. I chose comforting because it had been one of those mornings, and the app immediately suggested chicken tenders and mac and cheese. It felt a little too on the nose, but I went with it. As I waited for my order, I scrolled through social media. My feed was a mix of cat videos, strangers oversharing their feelings, and ads tailored disturbingly well to my recent thoughts. Just 2 days ago, I'd been thinking about getting a new water bottle, not even saying it out loud, just thinking it. And now every other post was an ad for insulated stainless steel hydration vessels. Is this mind reading? I muttered to my phone, shaking it like a magic 8-ball. The screen stayed silent, which was probably for the best. When the food finally arrived, I opened the bag to find a handwritten note on the receipt. "Hope this meal brings you the comfort you deserve. smiley face. There was even a little doodle of a smiling chicken tender. I stared at it, both touched and slightly unnerved by the intimacy of the gesture. Somewhere out there, a stranger with a Sharpie had decided I deserved comfort, and honestly, they weren't wrong. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of small, modern oddities. My smartwatch buzzed every hour to remind me to stand up and move, even though I'd been pacing the apartment for 10 minutes trying to figure out why my Wi-Fi wasn't working. My music app decided to curate a playlist called Songs to Help You Focus, which inexplicably included techno remixes of classical symphonies. And at one point, my fridge sent me a notification. Your eggs expire in 2 days. Consider making an omelet. I ignored it, purely out of spite. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, not from work, but from interacting with the endless parade of helpful, quirky little nudges from my devices. I sat on the couch, pulled up Netflix, and was greeted with the usual question. Are you still watching? I sighed. Of course I was still watching. But instead of clicking yes, I stared at the screen for a moment and whispered, what happens if I say no? I imagined Netflix sighing in relief, shutting itself down, and saying, finally, go outside. But I wasn't going outside. Not yet. I had one last task, shopping for a new toothbrush. Mine had started making this sad, wheezing noise that sounded like a dying kazoo, so it was time to upgrade. I found myself scrolling through an endless array of smart toothbrushes with features I didn't even know I needed. One had AI-powered brushing feedback. Another could connect to an app to track toothbrushing goals. Brushing goals. Eventually, I settled on a mid-tier model that promised a brighter smile in just 2 weeks, and clicked buy. As the confirmation page loaded, a cheerful animation of a cartoon tooth appeared, winking at me. See you soon, it said. I closed my laptop, sat back, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how absurd my day had been. In just 12 hours, I'd formed a bond with a digital dog, rated a piece of toast, and been emotionally supported by a smiling chicken tender. This is the world we live in now, one where even the smallest, strangest interactions feel like part of some surreal, ongoing comedy. And honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. What about you? What's the weirdest thing that's happened to you recently that made you laugh and think, yep, this is modern life? I had no business being on that train. It was one of those impulsive decisions that doesn't feel real until you're too far in to back out. I was supposed to be at my best friend's engagement party that night, wearing a floral dress and smiling awkwardly at her fiancé's relatives while sipping cheap champagne. Instead, I was in a thrifted coat, clutching a half-empty backpack, sitting in the last car of a train heading somewhere I couldn't even pronounce. The train wasn't crowded, just a handful of people scattered throughout the dimly lit cabin, most of them absorbed in their phones or staring blankly out the window. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the endless countryside into a watercolor mess of gray and green. I told myself I'd bought the ticket to clear my head, to give myself some time away from all the suffocating expectations waiting for me back home. But really, I had no idea what I was doing. At the next stop, a man boarded. He looked out of place. Sharp suit, slicked back hair, the kind of briefcase that probably cost more than my rent. He moved with purpose, scanning the car like he was searching for something. Or someone. I glanced away, not wanting to make eye contact, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stop suddenly, his gaze locking onto the seat across from me. Is this seat taken? He asked. I shook my head, though I desperately wished I could say yes. There were plenty of open seats, but for some reason, he chose mine. He slid into the booth across from me, setting his briefcase on the table between us with a soft click. I couldn't help but notice how pale his hands were, the veins standing out like a map. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, the train rocking gently as it picked up speed. I tried to ignore him, staring at the raindrops racing down the window like tiny comets. But then he spoke. You're not supposed to be here. His voice was calm, matter of fact, like he was pointing out the weather. I blinked, startled. Excuse me? You're not supposed to be on this train, he said again, his pale gray eyes boring into mine. This isn't your journey. I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking, But he didn't smile. My fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack. "It's a public train," I said. "I don't think there's a rule against—" "You misunderstand," he interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "This train doesn't pick people by accident. If you're here, it's because you've taken someone else's place." The words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to sound firm. "I bought a ticket. I'm just traveling." "To where?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated. I'd picked the destination at random when buying my ticket, but I couldn't seem to recall the name now. It was something with too many consonants, wasn't it? My mind felt foggy, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. The man tilted his head, studying me with unsettling intensity. "You don't know, do you? Okay, what's your deal?" I snapped, my unease bubbling into anger. "Why are you bothering me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thin, leather-bound notebook. It looked old, the edges of the pages yellowed and curling. He opened it, flipping through with deliberate precision before sliding it across the table toward me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I looked down. The pages were filled with names, written in looping, elegant handwriting. Each one had a date next to it, some from decades ago, others from just weeks past. My stomach tightened when I saw a name I recognized. My grandmother's. The date next to it was the day she'd passed away. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The manifest," he said simply. "It records everyone who has ever taken this train." I flipped through the pages, my fingers trembling. About halfway through, I found my own name. The date next to it was today. "No," I said, shaking my head. "This is some kind of trick." He leaned back in his seat, watching me with a strange mix of pity and detachment. "It's no trick. The train only carries those whose journeys are ending." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. "Are you saying I'm dying?" My voice cracked, the question too absurd and terrifying to feel real. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Not necessarily. The train responds to choice. If you're here, it means you're at a crossroads. It's up to you which way the journey goes." I stared at him, my heart pounding. What does that even mean? Before he could answer, the train jolted violently, throwing me against the window. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. So was his briefcase. The cabin was eerily quiet. The other passengers were still there, but something about them had changed. Their faces were blank, their eyes glassy, like dolls left on a shelf. I stood up, the hairs on my arms standing on end, and made my way toward the front of the car. The next door led to an empty corridor, dimly lit and lined with mirrors on both sides. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The movements were delayed, the expression slightly off, like a glitch in a video. I moved quickly, refusing to look too closely, until I reached another door. When I opened it, I stepped into a world that wasn't mine. The landscape outside was surreal. Skies that shifted from gold to purple, rivers that ran backward, trees with leaves made of fire. It felt alive, pulsating with energy that buzzed against my skin. In the distance, I saw figures moving, shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably there. A voice echoed behind me, the man's voice. "Choose carefully. Once you cross the threshold, there's no going back." I turned, but the corridor was gone. The door had vanished, leaving only the strange, pulsating world ahead of me. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. Was this real? A dream? A punishment for skipping my best friend's party? The air seemed to hum with anticipation, waiting for me to decide. I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and let the train carry me to wherever it was going. Have you ever felt like your life was balancing on a single choice? Like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what you do next? The clock struck 3:03 a.m., a time that felt neither late nor early but suspended in some hollow, liminal space. Clara sat on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a restless night. Half-finished tea, scattered tarot cards, and a notebook filled with questions she couldn't answer. The city outside her window buzzed faintly, the hum of life reduced to a whisper. Clara felt like an intruder in her own home, as if she'd accidentally stumbled into someone else's existence. That was when the knock came. It wasn't loud or urgent, just 3 soft raps on the door, polite but deliberate. She froze, her pen poised mid-sentence. Who knocks at 3 a.m.? The building was secure, the front door locked, and she hadn't ordered anything. "Hello?" she called, her voice tight. But there was no reply. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But curiosity had always been her downfall. Rising to her feet, she tiptoed toward the door and pressed her eye to the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, bathed in the flickering light of a single fluorescent bulb. She frowned and double-checked the locks, ensuring they were secure. As she turned to walk away, the knocking came again. 3 soft raps, this time from the opposite wall of her apartment. Her heart skipped. She lived on the 8th floor. The wall was solid brick. There was no adjoining apartment, no balcony, no space for someone to knock. She stared at the wall, her breath caught in her throat, and then it came again. Rap, rap, rap. "Who's there?" she demanded, louder now, her voice echoing in the silence. The room answered with a creak, the kind would makes under strain. Clara's bookshelves leaned slightly, as if under a sudden weight, and the air turned cold. She felt it then, the shift, a presence. Not visible, not tangible, but unmistakable. Her instinct screamed to leave, but her feet wouldn't move. She stared at the wall, at the spot where the knocking had come, and in a moment of madness, or bravery, she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the brick. The wall wasn't cold like it should have been. It was warm, alive. Before she could pull away, her hand sank into the surface like a stone through water. She yelped, trying to yank her arm back, but the wall had her, its grip both firm and unyielding. The room blurred around her, the light dimming to a soft, pulsating red, and then she was falling. Not backward or forward, but inward. When she landed, it was on smooth, black stone. The air was thick, tinged with the metallic scent of ozone, and the space around her was vast and dark. Shapes moved in the shadows, glimpses of glistening limbs, too many to belong to one creature. "Welcome," said a voice, low and sonorous, as though the stone itself had spoken. Clara turned, her hands trembling. The figure standing before her was tall and draped in flowing, tattered fabric that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, white-hot embers, burned with an intensity that pinned her in place. "I didn't mean to," she stammered, but the figure held up a hand, silencing her. "You have entered the between," it said, its voice reverberating through her bones. "You knocked, and the door answered." "I didn't knock," Clara began, but the figure tilted its head. "Didn't you?" it asked, and its tone was almost amused. "All your questions. You're searching. Your endless desire to know. You knock every time you ask the universe for more than it is willing to give." Clara swallowed hard. I wanted answers. And now you must pay the price for them." The shadows shifted again, and this time Clara saw them. Creatures with no discernible form but dozens of eyes, mouths, and appendages. They slithered closer, their movement hypnotic, and she felt the pull of them like gravity. "I didn't ask for this," she cried, backing away. The figure stepped closer, and as it moved, the space seemed to constrict, the walls closing in. "There is no undoing what has been set in motion. But perhaps," it said, almost thoughtfully, "we can make a trade." "What kind of trade?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "You may leave this place, but only if you give me something of equal value to what you seek." Clara's thoughts raced. She had no idea what she sought. She had been searching for years, trying to fill some unnameable void, trying to understand why she felt so untethered from her own life. The figure seemed to sense her hesitation. "Your memories," it said. "Your past." "My past," she echoed. "I will take every memory you have known, every experience that has shaped you. You will leave unburdened, free to rebuild yourself anew. Or," it gestured to the creatures now circling her, "you may stay." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. The thought of losing everything she was, every laugh, every heartbreak, every fragment of her identity, was terrifying. But so was staying in this place, in this darkness, forever. "What happens if I leave without my memories?" she asked. The figure's ember eyes flared. "You become potential, unshaped and untainted. A blank canvas. It is not death, but it is not life as you know it." Clara hesitated. What was her past, anyway? A series of missteps, unanswered questions, and regrets. But there had been beauty, too. Friends. Love. The feel of sunlight on her skin. "I need time to think," she whispered. "There is no time here," the figure replied, its voice hardening. "Choose." Clara looked at the creatures, at their shifting forms and endless eyes. She thought of her lonely apartment, her scattered tarot cards, her aching curiosity. And then, taking a deep breath, she made her choice. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The clock read 3:03 a.m. The box of tarot cards was gone. So was her notebook. She sat on the floor, staring at the wall, and realized with a sinking feeling that she couldn't remember her name. But she smiled, just faintly, because the emptiness inside her was finally gone. So, I have this phenomenon that happens whenever I like someone. And no, I don't mean normal stuff like blushing or getting butterflies. I mean my actual literal world starts to glitch. Okay, not like Matrix-level glitching, I wish, but weird coincidences and tiny, impossible-to-ignore oddities start popping up, as if the universe is elbowing me in the ribs going, "Hey, you noticing this?" And trust me, I'm noticing. The first time I realized this was a thing was in college. I had a crush on this guy in my philosophy of ethics class. Messy curls, glasses, always looked like he was 2 espressos away from solving world hunger. Classic intellectual hotness. Anyway, one day I'm sitting in class, half listening to the lecture, and I notice something strange. He's doodling on the edge of his notebook, and I swear to every deity imaginable. It's a doodle of the exact same weird, abstract shape I'd drawn on the back of my hand earlier that day. It wasn't like a normal doodle either. It was this odd little swirl that looked like a seashell, but lopsided. My brain short-circuited. I spent the rest of the class staring at his notebook like it was a treasure map to his soul. I told myself it was just a coincidence. People draw swirly shapes all the time, I thought. But then, the same week, we were assigned to work on a group project together, randomly selected by the professor, mind you. And when we met up to brainstorm ideas, he said the exact same sentence I'd written in my journal that morning. Is morality just a loophole for self-interest? My jaw almost hit the library floor. Was this guy reading my mind? Were we cosmically linked? Did I stumble into some kind of psychic rom-com? I was so caught up trying to decipher the signs that I barely contributed to the project, which, side note, was about logical fallacies, because the universe clearly has a sense of humor. It doesn't stop at coincidences, either. When I start crushing on someone, reality itself starts to feel off. I once liked this barista at a cafe near my apartment. One day, I decided to take the plunge and strike up a conversation. I mentally prepared myself, ran through opening lines, even practiced looking casual while pretending to read the menu. Spoiler: it's impossible to look casual while staring at a chalkboard. I finally walked up to the counter, opened my mouth to order, and the power went out. In the entire cafe. Lights off, espresso machines dead. Even the music stopped mid-lyric. The barista just looked at me and said, "Huh, guess you're bad luck?" I laughed awkwardly, ordered an iced tea that didn't require electricity, and spent the rest of the day convinced I'd accidentally short-circuited the grid with my nerves. And then there was the time I liked this woman in my building who always wore a blue beanie and walked her dog at exactly 6:30 every evening. I decided I'd casually bump into her one night, maybe compliment her dog, and see where it went. But the closer it got to 6:30, the more my apartment started feeling weird. My phone glitched out and kept resetting the clock to 5 o'clock, no matter how many times I tried to fix it. Then, when I went to leave, my elevator refused to come to my floor, even though I could hear it dinging everywhere else. I ended up running down 6 flights of stairs like a lunatic, only to trip on the last step and land right in front of her and her dog. She helped me up, of course. She was lovely. But all I could think was, what the hell is happening? I've started keeping a mental tally of these moments, what I call my crush glitches. Like, there was this guy I liked who played piano at a jazz club downtown. I swear, every time I thought about going to see him, my Spotify would randomly shuffle to jazz songs, even though I didn't have any in my playlists. Or the time I was crushing on my coworker, and during a meeting, the screen froze on his face for a solid 30 seconds, right when he was mid-laugh. Everyone else in the room thought it was funny, but I just sat there like, oh cool, the universe is buffering. The wildest one, though, last summer, I was at this outdoor market with some friends, and I saw this person selling handmade jewelry. They were cute, like, wow cute. They had this warm smile and were wearing a shirt that said, "Ask me about your future," which was ironic because that's all I wanted to know about them. I worked up the courage to approach their stall, and just as I was about to say something, the wind picked up out of nowhere. I'm not talking about a breeze. I'm talking about a full-on, paper-flying, hair-in-my-face gust. A little sign from their booth literally blew into my hands. It read, "Your path is exactly where it needs to be." I looked up at them, flustered, and they just laughed and said, "I think that's yours now." Reader, I was speechless. Was that a sign? Or just a sign? Who knows? I ended up buying a bracelet I didn't need and walking away before my brain melted. Here's the thing. I've spent years trying to figure out if these glitches mean anything, or if I just notice them more because I'm hyper-aware when I like someone. Maybe it's my brain connecting dots that don't exist, trying to make sense of my feelings by projecting them onto the universe. Or maybe it is the universe, nudging me toward the people I'm supposed to meet, even if it feels like a cosmic prank half the time. Whatever it is, I've started leaning into it. If reality's going to get weird when I catch feelings, I might as well embrace the chaos, right? So now, when my phone glitches or a light flickers at just the right moment, I take it as a sign to stop overthinking and just say something. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but at least I'm not waiting for the universe to write the whole love story for me anymore. So, tell me, does anyone else feel like the universe messes with them when they have a crush? Or is it just me, tripping through life like the romantic lead in a sci-fi comedy? The house on Tanglewood Lane wasn't haunted. At least, not in the way people think of hauntings. There were no flickering lights, no icy drafts, no ghostly moans creeping through the walls at night. It was quiet, still, like a forgotten book gathering dust on a shelf. But there was something about it. A pull, like the house itself had been waiting for someone to come inside. That someone, apparently, was me. I stumbled across it during one of those summer afternoons where time feels liquid, where the air is heavy with the smell of rain that never quite comes. I was on my usual wander, walking without a destination, when I saw the gate. It was wrought iron, tall and intricate, with patterns that looked almost like twisting vines, but when I ran my fingers over them, they felt like the ridges of something alive. The gate wasn't locked, but it groaned when I pushed it open, the kind of sound that makes you hesitate. Still, I went through. The yard was overgrown, a tangle of ivy and wildflowers and trees that seemed older than time itself. The house stood at the center, 3 stories tall, its windows black and blank like they were holding their breath. The paint had peeled away in strips, revealing the weathered wood beneath, but the door was strangely pristine, deep red, almost like a drop of blood in the middle of all that gray. I should have turned around. I know that now, but I was 14, bored, and endlessly curious, so I climbed the creaking steps and knocked. The door swung open before my knuckles touched the wood. Just a little, just enough to let a sliver of shadow spill out onto the porch. It was like the house had been expecting me. I didn't want to call out, didn't want to break the stillness, so I stepped inside instead. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper, metallic, like old coins. The floorboards groaned under my weight, but otherwise, the house was silent. The entryway led into a grand hall, with a staircase spiraling up into the shadows. Light filtered through the dusty windows and fractured beams, catching on motes of dust that hung in the air like tiny galaxies. The walls were lined with paintings, all of them portraits of people who didn't quite look real. Their faces were too sharp, their eyes too bright, their expressions too knowing, like they were in on a joke I'd never understand. I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps muffled by thick, faded rugs. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I wasn't looking for anything, but the house seemed to guide me, pulling me down hallways and through rooms that felt both impossibly large and suffocatingly small. And then I found the room. It was at the end of a long corridor, the kind that seems to stretch further the more you walk. The door was smaller than the others, painted the same deep red as the front door. It had no handle, just a brass keyhole that glinted in the dim light. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket. I don't know why I did it. I hadn't felt anything there before. But when my fingers closed around something cool and heavy, I pulled it out and found a key. It was old, the kind of key you'd expect to find in a fairy tale, with intricate patterns etched into the metal. It fit perfectly. The door swung open silently, revealing a room that didn't belong in the house. It was enormous, impossibly so, like stepping into the night sky itself. The floor was black marble, polished to a mirror shine, and the ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into darkness. Floating above me were orbs of light, soft and golden, like stars that had been plucked from the sky and scattered here. At the center of the room stood a table, long and narrow, with a single chair at each end. On the table was a chessboard, but the pieces weren't like any chess pieces I'd ever seen. They weren't carved from wood or stone, but seemed to be made of light, flickering softly as they waited for their turn. And then I saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the table, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other hovering over the chessboard. He was young, maybe 18 or 20, with sharp features and eyes that glowed faintly, like embers buried beneath ash. He didn't look surprised to see me. "You're late," he said, his voice low and smooth, like the hum of a distant storm. "I didn't know I was supposed to be here," I said, which sounded ridiculous as soon as the words left my mouth. He smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on a cat right before it pounced. No one ever does. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he gestured to the chair at the other end of the table. "Sit." I should have left. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around and run, but I sat. He moved a piece on the chessboard, a knight, its light flaring briefly before settling. "Your move," he said. I stared at the board. I didn't know the rules of this game, if it was even a game at all, but I reached out and moved one of the pieces. It felt warm under my fingers, almost alive. The game went on, each move filling the room with a low hum, like the air itself was reacting. With each turn, the orbs of light above us shifted, rearranging themselves into constellations I didn't recognize. I don't know how long we played. Time felt slippery, unmoored, like it had no power here. Eventually, I made a move that caused his smile to falter. Just for a moment, but I saw it. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is this?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. His glowing eyes met mine. "A test." "For what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, the game unfinished, and walked toward me. He reached out, placing something in my hand. When I looked down, I saw another key, this one smaller and simpler than the first. "Keep it safe," he said. "You'll need it someday." "Need it for what?" I asked, but he was already walking away, fading into the darkness until he was gone. When I looked back at the table, the chessboard and its pieces had disappeared. The room felt smaller now, colder. I found my way out of the house somehow, though the details are fuzzy. When I stepped outside, the sky was dark, the stars above eerily similar to the constellations I'd seen in the room. I rode my bike home, clutching the key in my hand, and didn't tell anyone what had happened. I still have the key. I don't know what it opens, but sometimes, when I hold it, I feel the faint hum of something waiting. Something I'll need to face one day, whether I'm ready or not. Have you ever found something you can't explain? Something you're not even sure is real, but it lingers, heavy in your hand, in your heart, like it's waiting for its moment? I saw it as I was walking home from the corner store, a paper bag of groceries cradled in one arm. At first, I thought it was just a strange cloud, a jagged streak of shimmering light cutting across the horizon. But then it moved, rippling like fabric caught in the wind. People on the street stopped to look up, murmuring, their faces tilted toward the sky. Someone pulled out their phone, trying to record it, but their screen stayed black, as if the camera couldn't capture what was there. I stood frozen, a carton of eggs slipping slightly in my grip when the tear widened. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it, a deep, thrumming vibration in my chest, like the air itself was trembling. Beyond the tear was something, not quite light, not quite darkness. It was a shifting, iridescent void that made my eyes water if I looked at it too long. Then, something fell out. It wasn't a meteor or a machine. It was a small, black cube, perfectly smooth, no bigger than a child's lunchbox. It dropped silently, landing just a few feet from where I stood. The crowd backed away instinctively, forming a loose circle around it. No one dared move closer, except me. I don't know why I stepped forward. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, pulled by some invisible string. The cube hummed faintly as I approached, and the air around it felt warmer, heavier. As I crouched down, I realized it wasn't made of metal or stone. It was something else entirely, something almost organic. "Don't touch it!" someone shouted from behind me, but I was already reaching out. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the world around me vanished. I was standing in a forest now, though it was like no forest I'd ever seen. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks spiraling upward in hues of gold and silver. The leaves above me glowed faintly, casting a soft, ethereal light. The air smelled of pine and something sweet, like honey or wildflowers. In the distance, a river flowed upward into the sky, its water defying gravity, twisting and looping like a ribbon of glass. Strange creatures flitted between the trees, things with too many wings, or too many eyes, or no discernible shape at all. They didn't seem to notice me, and I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of this place. No one answered, but the cube, still in my hand, began to vibrate. A beam of light shot out from it, pointing like an arrow deeper into the forest. I hesitated. Going deeper felt like a risk, but staying here felt wrong. Like the world itself would reject me if I lingered too long. So I followed the light. The forest grew stranger as I walked. The ground beneath me wasn't dirt or grass, but something soft, almost like velvet, and it pulsed faintly with each step. The trees began to hum, their tones shifting as I passed, like they were communicating with each other, or with me. After what felt like hours, the beam of light led me to a clearing. In the center stood a massive structure that looked like a tree and a tower had been fused together. Its bark shimmered like metal, and its roots dug deep into the ground, glowing faintly at the edges. At its base was a door. The cube in my hand pulsed once, twice, then went still. The beam of light disappeared. I approached the door cautiously. It was carved with intricate symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a smooth surface that radiated warmth. "Place your hand on it," a voice said behind me. I spun around, heart racing. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadows. Their face was obscured, but their presence was overwhelming, calm yet commanding, like they belonged to this place in a way I never could. "What is this?" I asked, clutching the cube tightly. "The beginning," they replied, "or the end. That depends on you." I wanted to ask more, but the figure stepped closer, and I felt a strange pull, like gravity itself had shifted. "You've been chosen," they said, their voice soft but unyielding. "The cube brought you here because it sensed something in you. A potential, a question, a hunger. But the path forward isn't without cost." "What cost?" They didn't answer. Instead, they gestured toward the door. "Step through, and you'll know." I turned back to the door, my heart pounding. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Can I go back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can always go back," the figure said, "but you won't be the same." I hesitated, the weight of the cube suddenly heavier in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to return to the life I knew. But another part of me, the part that had stepped forward when the cube first fell from the sky, Knew I wouldn't. I placed my hand on the door. The symbols flared to life, spinning and rearranging themselves until they formed an image, a constellation I didn't recognize. The door slid open, revealing a swirling void that seemed to stretch into infinity. The figure behind me spoke one last time, "Choose wisely," and then I stepped through. The void swallowed me whole, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sensation, just endless, weightless silence. When I emerged, I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was standing in a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a version of me I didn't recognize. In one, I wore a crown made of fire. In another, my hands glowed with light, shaping worlds out of nothing. In yet another, I was older, my eyes lined with wisdom and sadness. The cube in my hand melted away, its warmth sinking into my skin. A voice echoed through the room, deep and resonant. "Now, write your story." I stared at the mirrors, each one holding a life I could claim, a path I could take. And for the first time, I realized the question wasn't about the cost of stepping forward, it was about the cost of standing still. So I chose. It started with the man on the bus holding a goldfish in a blender. Not an actual blender in use, thank God. The blades had been removed, and the pitcher was clean, filled with water and one very agitated goldfish swimming frantic circles inside. The man holding it looked completely unbothered, as if cradling kitchenware full of aquatic life was just another Tuesday. He was dressed for business, pressed slacks, a tie with a pattern of tiny, smiling suns. But the fish was the only thing anyone could look at. "Is that safe?" someone finally asked, a teenager in a hoodie sitting across from him. The man glanced up, adjusting his wireframe glasses. "For the fish or the blender?" The teenager blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. The man gave a small, almost apologetic smile, as if he understood that his existence was, at that moment, the most confusing thing in the universe. "Don't worry," he said, "Kevin's fine." Then, as if that explained everything, he went back to looking out the window, the blender perched delicately on his lap. I got off the bus 2 stops early because I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin the goldfish had just set the tone for the day. It was one of those late mornings where the sunlight seemed thicker, almost syrupy, like the universe had hit snooze too many times. I walked aimlessly, weaving through side streets I didn't know, until I stumbled onto a cafe that wasn't on my mental map of the neighborhood. The sign over the door read The Fig and Whimsy. A bit pretentious, sure, but I had time to kill and a vague craving for coffee, so I went in. The inside was strange in a way that I didn't immediately notice, like stepping into a room and realizing a minute too late that the furniture is all slightly tilted. The walls were covered in clocks, but none of them told the correct time. Or if they did, they weren't all telling the same one. A cuckoo clock above the counter chirped exactly 6 times as I walked in, even though the hands pointed to 11:17. The barista wore a sweater with a pattern of teapots and moved with the deliberate precision of someone who was very used to questions. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice warm but distracted. Just a black coffee," I said, glancing at the menu, which included items like cloudberry fizz and philosopher's tea. "Sure thing," she said, turning to fill the order. Then, without looking back at me, she added, "Careful though. It's one of those days." I froze. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, pouring coffee into a mismatched mug that said "World's Okayest Farmer." "You'll see." I didn't know what to do with that, so I took the coffee and found a seat near the back, next to a shelf of books with titles like How to Apologize to Ghosts and Baking for Pirates. My table wobbled slightly, and when I tried to fix it by sticking a folded napkin under one of the legs, I found a slip of paper taped to the underside. It read, "Today is not for explanations. It's for finding out." I should have left. Any sensible person would have walked out right then, chalked this all up to caffeine deprivation, and gone back to the safety of normality. But I didn't. Something about the oddness felt inviting, like a dare whispered between the cracks of an ordinary day. Outside the cafe, the world was shifting, not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost imperceptible increments. A woman walking her dog passed by wearing a full Victorian gown, complete with a parasol. The dog wore a matching cravat. A man on a unicycle played the ukulele, his eyes closed as if serenading the street itself. Nobody seemed surprised by any of it, least of all the kids drawing on the sidewalk with chalk, their designs more intricate than anything you'd find in an art museum. One kid had drawn a perfect replica of a stained glass window, complete with light patterns that shimmered in ways chalk definitely shouldn't. I walked without direction, sipping my coffee, until I came to a narrow alley that didn't seem like it should exist. The entrance was framed by two mismatched lampposts, one bent at a comical angle, the other so tall it disappeared into the sky. A small sign hung crookedly between them, shortcut to anywhere. Proceed with curiosity. Normally, I'd laugh and keep walking. But something about the day, the goldfish, the cafe, it all felt like an invitation. So I stepped in. The alley stretched longer than it should have. Its walls covered in posters advertising events I was pretty sure weren't real. Annual cloud race, sign up now, one read, showing cartoonish puffs wearing sunglasses. Another advertised lessons in beginner magic, first spell guaranteed, with a picture of a wand dripping stars like water. I reached out to touch one of the posters, and for a brief second, I swear I felt a pulse beneath my fingertips, like the bricks themselves were alive. When I reached the end of the alley, I wasn't in the city anymore. I was in a clearing surrounded by tall trees, their leaves shimmering as if they'd been dipped in gold. In the center of the clearing was a table, and around it sat people who looked like they belonged in every time period but this one. A knight polishing his gauntlet, a flapper adjusting her sequined headband, a woman in futuristic armor sipping tea out of a dainty porcelain cup. Kevin the goldfish was there too, still in his blender, now sitting on a velvet cushion at the head of the table. "Ah," said the knight, looking up as I approached. "Another one." "Late, but curious," added the flapper, raising her teacup. Kevin gurgled approvingly. "Sit," said the woman in the armor, pulling out a chair for me. "We've been waiting." "For what?" I asked, more overwhelmed than I'd ever been in my life. The knight smiled, his teeth too white for someone from his era. "For you to find out." And somehow, I knew that was the only answer I was going to get. The moment I realized my life had taken a weird turn, I was standing in the middle of a public park, holding an umbrella made of spaghetti. Let me explain. The day had started out normal enough. Work had been the usual grind of emails, meetings, and pretending I understood spreadsheets. By lunchtime, I was fried. So I decided to take my sandwich and sit at the park near my office. It was one of those perfect spring afternoons. Blue skies, soft breeze, birds chirping like they were auditioning for a Disney movie. I found a bench under a big oak tree, unwrapped my turkey sandwich, and prepared to revel in my mediocrity. That's when I saw her. She was dressed in head-to-toe neon green, the kind of outfit that makes you question if someone got lost on their way to a rave. Her hair was a wild mess of curls, dyed the same color as cotton candy, and she was carrying what looked like a giant cardboard box. Normally, I wouldn't give someone like that a second glance. It's the city, weird is the norm. But there was something magnetic about her. She was headed toward the fountain in the center of the park, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested she was about to change someone's life. I had no idea it would be mine. I finished my sandwich and, out of pure curiosity, followed her at a safe distance. She stopped at the fountain, set the box on the edge, and started pulling things out. A colander, a ladle, a large pot, and about 15 boxes of spaghetti. She worked quickly, filling the pot with water from the fountain and dumping in the pasta. People started to gather around, murmuring in confusion, but she ignored them. She was in her zone, a culinary artist at work. By now, a crowd had formed. Someone asked, "What's going on here?" Another person muttered, "Is this performance art or just lunch?" The woman didn't answer. She just kept stirring the pot with the ladle, humming a tune that sounded vaguely familiar, like an old lullaby. And then it started to rain. Not a drizzle either. This was the kind of downpour that makes you question why you ever leave your house. People scattered, running for cover, but not her. She stood by her pot of spaghetti, completely unfazed, as if the rain was part of her plan. I should have left too, but I couldn't. Something about her felt significant, like if I walked away, I'd be missing out on something I couldn't name. So, there I was, standing in the rain like an idiot, watching a stranger cook pasta in a public park. And that's when she looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. Her eyes were sharp, a shade of blue that didn't seem real. She tilted her head and said, "Hold this." Before I could respond, she thrust a bundle of spaghetti into my hands. It was cooked but somehow still hot, and I just stood there, baffled. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. She grinned, the kind of grin that makes you suspicious. "Make it useful." What did that even mean? Make it useful? I wanted to ask, but before I could, she turned back to her pot and started scooping spaghetti into the colander. Meanwhile, the rain was coming down harder, and I was soaked. The spaghetti in my hands was steaming, practically melting into a mushy blob. And then, in a moment of desperation, or inspiration, depending on how you look at it, I draped the spaghetti over my head like a hat. It worked better than I expected. The strands clumped together, creating a kind of umbrella that kept most of the rain off my face. It was ridiculous, sure, but it was also effective. A guy jogging by stopped in his tracks, pointed at me, and shouted, "Genius!" Another person pulled out their phone and started taking pictures. Within seconds, half the crowd was trying to copy me, draping spaghetti over their heads like it was the latest fashion trend. The woman turned back, saw what was happening, and burst out laughing. "That's the spirit," she yelled, throwing her hands in the air like she was conducting some kind of chaotic orchestra. "Spaghetti for all." She started handing out more pasta, and soon the park was filled with people wearing spaghetti hats, spaghetti scarves, spaghetti everything. The rain didn't stop, but no one seemed to care anymore. We were laughing, dripping wet but somehow joyful, united by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Eventually, the woman packed up her pot and colander, gave me a wink, and said, "Keep the hat. You've earned it." And then she walked away, leaving me and the rest of the spaghetti-clad strangers to fend for ourselves. I went back to work late that afternoon, still soggy and reeking of marinara. My coworkers stared but didn't say anything, which was probably for the best. What was I supposed to tell them? That I'd spent my lunch break having a pasta-based existential awakening? The thing is, it wasn't just a weird afternoon. Something about it stuck with me. The way the woman didn't care about the rain or the crowd, or how ridiculous she looked. The way she turned something as mundane as spaghetti into a moment none of us would forget. It was like she'd hacked life, figured out how to make it less serious, more alive. I kept the spaghetti hat for a while. I didn't wear it, obviously, but every time I saw it sitting on my counter, I'd smile. It reminded me that even the most ordinary things, a park, a rainy day, a box of pasta, can be extraordinary if you let them. Have you ever had a moment like that, where something so random and absurd completely flips your perspective? Or am I the only one out here wearing spaghetti hats in the rain? This morning, I found a key on the sidewalk. It was just lying there, small and silver, with a little blue tag attached. The tag had no writing on it, but there was a scratch down the middle, as if someone had once tried to carve a message and thought better of it. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Picking it up felt like picking up someone else's secret, but leaving it felt like ignoring an invitation. So, I took it. That's how my day started. With a key to a lock I'd never seen and a strange sense that the city had decided to tell me a story. As I walked toward the train station, the world around me felt just slightly different. The bakery on the corner had the smell of fresh croissants wafting out the door, but today the baker had set out a small chalkboard sign that read, "Today's secret ingredient." Magic? A joke? Probably, but the kind that makes you wonder if the punchline is meant just for you. I watched a woman in a trench coat pause at the sign and grin, as if she and the baker were sharing a private joke. Then she walked inside, the little bell on the door jingling softly behind her. At the station, the crowd buzzed like usual, phones glowing, shoes scuffing, people talking to each other in half murmurs. I stood there with the key in my pocket, suddenly aware of how many locks must be in this city. Every door, every box, every bike chained to a railing. I wondered who had lost it, or if they left it on purpose. The train pulled in with its familiar roar, and I boarded, squeezing into a spot near the door. As the car jerked forward, I glanced around, half expecting someone to look at me and say, "That's mine." But no one did. Instead, I found myself caught in the strange, overlapping dramas of strangers. A man in a gray hoodie was flipping through a deck of tarot cards, muttering under his breath. He wasn't reading for anyone, just shuffling and reshuffling, pulling cards at random like he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. At one point, he drew the tower and scowled, shoving the whole deck into his pocket. Across from him, a woman in a bright yellow coat was scribbling furiously in a notebook, the pen moving so fast it looked like she was trying to outrun her thoughts. Between them sat a boy with headphones, completely still except for the slight tap of his foot, keeping time to a song no one else could hear. And then there was the man with the green umbrella. I hadn't noticed him at first. He was standing at the far end of the car, holding the umbrella like a cane, though there wasn't a drop of rain in sight. His eyes were closed, and he had the kind of calm presence that made him seem out of place, like he belonged in a quieter story than the one we were all in. At the next stop, he opened his eyes, glanced around, and stepped off the train without a word. But he left the umbrella behind. The doors closed, and for a second, no one moved. We all just stared at the umbrella, propped neatly against the pole. It was one of those old-fashioned ones, with a wooden handle and a deep green canopy that looked like it had been through 1,000 storms. Finally, the woman in the yellow coat got up and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, her pin tucked behind her ear, and then she sat back down with the umbrella on her lap, as if she'd been chosen for some task she didn't yet understand. I thought about the key in my pocket. 2 objects, 2 mysteries. The city felt full of them today, as if it were trying to see how much I'd notice. When I got off the train, the air felt heavier, thick with the promise of rain even though the sky was still clear. I walked past a coffee shop where a man was standing outside, holding a cardboard sign that read, "I lost something. If you find it, it's yours now." I almost stopped to ask him what he meant, but he caught my eye and smiled, like he already knew I had the key. Before I could say anything, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I kept moving, my steps slower now. Everything seemed loaded with meaning. The way a bicycle leaned against a lamppost without a lock, the way a pigeon stared at me from a park bench like it was guarding something important. I passed a florist setting out buckets of roses, and she was humming a song I couldn't place but felt like I'd heard before. Finally, I ducked into an alley, needing a moment to think. That's when I saw it. A small wooden door, barely taller than my shoulders, set into the brick wall. It didn't belong there. I'd walked this way 100 times and had never seen it before. The wood was dark and weathered, with a brass keyhole gleaming faintly in the dim light. My hand went to my pocket. The key was warm, as if it had been waiting for this. I hesitated, the city suddenly quiet around me. For a moment, I wondered if I should turn back, let the mystery be. But then I thought about the umbrella, the tarot cards, the chalkboard sign, and the man with the cardboard message. It felt like everything had been leading me here. So, I slid the key into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, and behind it was not what I expected. It wasn't a room or a passageway but a garden. A small, impossibly green garden, right in the heart of the city. There were flowers I couldn't name, their colors so vivid they didn't seem real, and a narrow path winding through the grass. At the center of the garden stood a tree with golden leaves, its branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. And beneath the tree was a table. On the table sat an envelope. I stepped inside, the air shifting around me like I'd crossed into another world. The envelope had no name, no address, just a single word written in elegant script, "Stay." I didn't know what it meant, but as I stood there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. What would you have done? Would you have turned the key? Or do you think some mysteries are better left untouched? It started with a penny, one of those tarnished, forgotten coins that you'd usually walk right past without a second thought. But this penny wasn't just lying on the sidewalk or wedged in the crack of a vending machine. It was sitting upright, perfectly balanced on its edge, in the middle of my living room floor. I stared at it for a long moment, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I lived alone. I didn't own any pets. There was no reason for a penny to be standing there, defying gravity in the middle of my carpet. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. "Weird, but whatever." I flicked the penny over with my foot, and it fell with a faint plink. Then I went about my day. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard something metallic clink against the tile floor of my bathroom. When I looked down, there it was, the penny. The same one, I was sure of it. It had a distinctive greenish stain on Lincoln's face, like a shadow he couldn't shake. And once again, it was balanced on its edge, as if mocking me. I bent down to pick it up, half expecting it to burn me or vanish in a puff of smoke. It didn't. It was just a penny, cool and ordinary in my hand. I dropped it in the jar I kept for loose change and went to bed, determined to ignore the creeping unease in my chest. The next morning, I woke up to find the penny on my nightstand, balanced on its edge. This wasn't just weird anymore. It was personal. I grabbed the penny, stuffed it in my pocket, and took it with me to work. At lunch, I tossed it into the fountain outside the office building and watched it sink. That'll teach it, I thought, feeling simultaneously foolish and victorious. By the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself it was over. Whatever prank or trick my brain had been playing was done. But when I walked into my kitchen and flipped on the light, there it was again, waiting for me. The penny, on the counter, balanced. This time, I didn't touch it. I stared at it for a while, trying to decide if I was losing my mind, or if the universe was screwing with me. Then, without thinking, I said, "All right, what do you want?" The penny tipped over and clattered to the floor. For a second, I thought that was it, that maybe I just needed to acknowledge it, and the whole bizarre episode was over. But then the lights flickered, and a voice, not loud, but low and crackling, like static on an old radio, said, "Find the others." The others? I froze, scanning the room for whatever had spoken. But the voice was gone, leaving me alone with the penny and a rising sense of dread. I didn't sleep much that night. By the time the sun rose, I'd convinced myself that the voice had been a dream or some kind of auditory hallucination. But then I found the second coin. It was a nickel this time, lying flat in the middle of my front porch. I wouldn't have thought anything of it except for the fact that etched into its surface, faint but unmistakable, was a tiny symbol. A triangle with a single dot in the center. I picked it up, holding it between my fingers, and felt a strange pull, like a magnet tugging at my chest. The penny was still in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, I realized it had the same symbol, only smaller and slightly worn. I didn't know what else to do, so I pocketed both coins and went about my day. But things only got stranger from there. Everywhere I went, coins started appearing. Dimes on the subway platform, quarters on the windowsill of my office, even an old silver dollar wedged into the pages of a library book I hadn't opened in years. Each one bore a unique symbol, a crescent moon, an hourglass, a spiral. By the time I'd found 10 coins, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Something was drawing me to them, or them to me. That night, as I sat cross-legged on my living room floor, examining the growing pile of coins, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. When I arranged them in a circle, the symbols lined up, forming a larger image, a map. Not a traditional map with roads and landmarks, but something more abstract, a series of shapes and lines that seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light of my desk lamp. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to follow it. The map led me to places I'd never been before. A crumbling stone bridge on the edge of town, an abandoned amusement park where the air felt charged with static, a dense stretch of forest that seemed to hum with its own heartbeat. Each time, I'd find another coin, carefully placed as if it had been waiting for me. The final coin came from the most unlikely place of all, the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn in years. It was heavier than the others, made of a strange, blackened metal, and its symbol was different. Not a shape this time, but a single word, home. When I added it to the circle, the map shifted. The lines and shapes began to glow, and for the first time, I understood what it was showing me. It wasn't leading me to a place. It was leading me to a moment, a memory I'd buried so deeply I almost didn't recognize it. I was 6 years old, standing in the middle of a crowded carnival, clutching my father's hand. He was holding a coin. No, the coin, and flipping it idly between his fingers. "This is the lucky one," he'd told me with a smile. "You keep this, and it'll always bring you back home." I'd forgotten that moment. Forgotten the coin, too. But now it was here, in my hand, the map finally complete. The lights in my apartment flickered, and for a brief moment, I felt a presence, warm and familiar, like an old sweater. The coin shimmered, then vanished, leaving only the blackened one behind. I still carry that coin with me. I don't know exactly what it did or why it came back to me, but I like to think it was a reminder, a little nudge from the universe to pay attention, to remember where I came from, to find my way back when I needed it most. Have you ever had something small and seemingly ordinary take on a life of its own? Something that felt like it was nudging you towards something bigger, something you didn't even realize you were missing? I wasn't looking for trouble when I took the painting. It was one of those decisions that felt harmless at the time, like pocketing a penny from a wishing fountain or taking an extra ketchup packet from a diner. The painting wasn't even valuable, at least, not to anyone else. It was leaning against a dumpster behind an antique shop, half covered by old newspapers, rain streaking its cracked frame. But something about it caught my eye. It was small, just a foot tall and half as wide, in one of those ornate, gaudy gold frames that looked like it belonged in a Victorian parlor. The painting itself was dark, almost muddy, the colors faded with age. It showed a forest at dusk, thick with trees that seemed to press in on the edges of the frame. In the distance, barely visible, was the faint outline of a house, its windows glowing with a warm, golden light. I don't know why I picked it up. It wasn't like I needed a painting. My apartment already looked like a dorm room explosion, with secondhand furniture and posters held up by tape. But there was something about it, something that made me feel like it would have been wrong to leave it there, like it was waiting for me. So, I took it home, hung it on the wall above my couch. And that's when things started to change. At first, it was subtle. The painting didn't seem so dark anymore. The colors looked richer, deeper, like they'd been polished overnight. The trees in the foreground became sharper, their bark rough and detailed, the kind of texture you could almost feel if you ran your fingers over it. And the house in the distance? The light in its windows seemed to glow a little brighter. I chalked it up to bad lighting in my apartment and went about my day. But the next morning, as I was brushing my teeth, something clicked in my brain. The painting had changed. Not just the colors or the details changed. There was a new tree on the left side of the frame, tall and thin, its branches stretching toward the house. It hadn't been there before. I stood in front of it for a long time, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Paintings don't grow new trees. I even Googled, can paintings change overnight, like a moron, but all I got was a bunch of articles about art restoration. Finally, I told myself that maybe I hadn't looked at it closely enough when I hung it up. It wasn't like I'd inspected every inch of it, but by the third day, there was no denying it. The painting was changing. The trees were closer to the house now, their shadows longer, darker. The golden light in the windows looked dimmer, like someone had turned off half the lamps inside. And then I noticed something else. In the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible at first, there was a figure. It was small, just a shadowy silhouette among the trees. A person, or at least the shape of one. I leaned in close, squinting at the painting, and for a moment, I thought I saw it move. Just a flicker, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. I didn't sleep that night. By the end of the week, I'd convinced myself I was losing my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to take the painting down. Every time I tried to grab it off the wall, my chest tightened, like my body was physically rejecting the idea. So I left it there, and the figure grew closer. I started leaving the apartment as much as possible, spending hours at coffee shops or wandering the aisles of the grocery store just to avoid being in the same room as the painting. But it didn't help. Every time I came home, the painting had changed. The figure was closer to the house. The light in the windows was dimmer. The shadows in the forest were longer. One night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the apartment. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. It came again. Knock, knock, knock. My first thought was the door, But when I crept into the living room, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the wall, from the painting. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was gone. The house in the distance was completely dark now, its windows empty. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I swear I could feel something watching me, something just beyond the edges of the frame. And then, in the dead quiet of my apartment, I heard it. A faint whisper, low and hollow, like whined through dead leaves. "Let me in." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before I grabbed a blanket and locked myself in the bathroom. I stayed there until the sun came up, too terrified to go back into the living room. When I finally worked up the courage to check the painting, the figure was back. But this time, it wasn't in the forest. It was standing on the front porch of the house. I lost it. I tore the painting off the wall, shoved it into a garbage bag, and drove to the nearest dumpster. I threw it in, piled a bunch of trash on top of it, and drove home, shaking the entire way. But when I walked into my apartment, the painting was back, hanging on the wall above the couch, exactly where it had been before. Only now, the figure was inside the house, standing in front of one of the windows, staring out. That was 2 weeks ago. I don't know what to do. The figure gets closer to the foreground every day. I stopped sleeping in the apartment. I stopped sleeping, period. I can feel it now, watching me, even when I'm not home. Especially when I'm not home. If you've ever heard of something like this, please tell me what to do. Because I think, maybe tonight, it'll finally step out of the frame. And I don't want to find out what happens when it does. It started with the toaster. Well, technically, it started with me, half asleep, trying to make toast while waiting for my coffee to brew. But the toaster was the one that pushed the situation from normal groggy morning into existential chaos. The thing about my toaster is that it's old. Like, the kind of old where the crumb tray doesn't slide out anymore. So you just sort of shake it over the sink and hope for the best. Every time I use it, I swear I hear it whisper, "This could be the day I explode." But I keep using it because it still makes toast and I'm too cheap to buy a new one. Anyway, I popped in a slice of bread, pressed the lever down and waited. Except this time, instead of its usual obedient click, the toaster didn't cooperate. The lever popped right back up. I pressed it again. It popped up again. I pressed harder, as if sheer determination could intimidate the toaster into compliance, but no dice. I sighed, rubbed my eyes, and leaned down to inspect it like some kind of toast detective. That's when I noticed the problem. There was something stuck inside. Something dark and jagged, wedged right between the wires. At first, I thought it was just a particularly rebellious crumb, but as I squinted closer, I realized it was a piece of charred toast. A piece of toast. Inside the toaster. I blinked, trying to process this. I don't mean burned bread from this morning. I mean a fully toasted slice of bread that somehow got left behind like a forgotten soldier in the trenches of breakfast. How long had it been in there? Days? Weeks? Years? Was this toaster haunted by the ghosts of breakfasts past? Was this bread some kind of time capsule? Suddenly, I was face to face with the deeply unsettling reality that I had been living in this apartment, using this toaster every day, with no idea it was hiding a rogue toast. And the toast was wrong. Like, deeply, existentially wrong. It wasn't just burnt. It was mummified, blackened, brittle, and twisted into a shape no bread should naturally take. If toast could scream, this one would be wailing. I grabbed a butter knife and started poking at it, trying to dislodge it. It didn't budge. This toast was anchored. It was like the toaster had absorbed it, like it was trying to make this poor slice part of its very soul. After a solid minute of scraping and jabbing, I finally managed to extract the toast corpse and held it up in the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. It was grotesque, a burnt offering to some breakfast god I didn't sign up to worship. That's when it hit me. This toast was me. Okay, I know that sounds dramatic, but hear me out. As I stood there, holding this charred, forgotten thing that had been stuck in a tiny, dark space for who knows how long, I started thinking about all the times I'd felt stuck. All the times I'd shoved parts of myself into the corner of my own life because I didn't want to deal with them. Dreams I'd forgotten about. Friendships I'd let wither. The hobbies I swore I'd pick back up someday but hadn't touched in years. All the things I used to be, now neglected, burnt out, and twisted into something unrecognizable. I stared at the toast, half expecting it to whisper, "You see it now, don't you?" But thankfully, it didn't. Because then I would have had to move and burn the toaster in some kind of ritual fire. Instead, I did what any normal person would do. I dropped it in the trash, washed my hands like it was a toxic biohazard, and stood there for a moment, trying to figure out why I suddenly felt so emotional. It wasn't just about the toast. It was about the way little things pile up without you noticing. A crumb here, a crumb there, until suddenly your toaster won't work because there's a metaphorical burnt slice of bread clogging up the wires of your life. But here's the weird part. Instead of feeling sad, I felt relieved, because I realized I'd found it. I'd found the thing that was stuck, and now I could fix it. So, I cleaned the toaster. Like, really cleaned it. I unscrewed the bottom, dumped out enough crumbs to feed a flock of pigeons, and scrubbed the wires with an old toothbrush. I even shined the outside so it looked brand new. When I plugged it back in and tested it with a fresh slice of bread, the lever went down smoothly. The toast popped up perfectly golden a few minutes later, and I nearly cried over how satisfying it was. I didn't stop there. That afternoon, I cleaned out my closet and finally donated all the clothes I'd been meaning to for years. I called an old friend I hadn't talked to in months and left her a rambling voicemail. I even sat down and opened the notebook where I used to write poetry, scrawling out a messy, unpolished draft that didn't feel half as rusty as I thought it would. It wasn't like I magically fixed my whole life because of one stupid piece of toast, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all it takes. You find one stuck thing, deal with it, and suddenly the rest doesn't seem so impossible anymore. The hardest part is noticing the toast in the first place. So, yeah, my toaster taught me a life lesson. Don't let the little things pile up. Clean out your metaphorical crumb tray before you end up holding a charred version of your own potential in your hands. Anyway, I'm curious. What's something small and ridiculous that's made you stop and rethink everything? Or at least made you clean your kitchen? They found the first box buried under the old oak tree. It was a metal tin, about the size of a shoebox, rusted and dented as if it had been there for decades. Inside, there was a single Polaroid photo, faded and yellowed with age. It showed a girl standing in front of a house, her face partially obscured by her long, dark hair. Scrawled at the bottom in black marker were the words, "Find me before they do." Everyone in town assumed it was some kind of prank. After all, Gray Pines was the kind of sleepy nowhere you'd only hear about if you got lost. But there was something about the photo that nagged at me, a gnawing sensation like I was forgetting something important. I didn't want to get involved. I'd only just moved back to Gray Pines after 20 years away, my tail tucked between my legs and my career in tatters. But the more I tried to ignore the story, the more the town seemed to pulse with a strange, electric energy. Every conversation, every glance, every quiet moment seemed to circle back to that photo. Then someone found the second box. This one was hidden behind the abandoned gas station on Route 8, tucked beneath a pile of scrap metal. Inside were more photos, all Polaroids, all taken from strange, unsettling angles, through a cracked window, from the shadows of a basement, under a streetlight at dusk. The same girl appeared in every picture, her face never fully visible. Some photos had writing on the back, cryptic fragments like, "Closer than you think," and "Don't let them see." The boxes kept appearing. Over the next week, they turned up in the strangest places. Buried beneath playground sand, taped to the underside of a church pew, even wedged inside a hollow tree trunk in the woods. And the photos grew darker, stranger. The girl was no longer just standing or sitting. She was running, hiding, staring wide-eyed at something just out of frame. By then, the whole town was involved. People combed through fields, barns, and attics, desperate to find the next box. It was like a collective madness had taken over. I wasn't immune. The morning I found my own box, I knew it was too late to turn back. It was sitting on my doorstep, perfectly clean despite the rainstorm the night before. The photo inside wasn't like the others. It was a picture of me, standing in my living room, holding my phone and staring at something behind the camera. I didn't remember the moment, but there I was, clear as day. Scrawled on the back in messy black ink, "They're coming." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside felt like a threat. I checked my locks twice, 3 times, but the feeling didn't go away. By 3 a.m., I was sitting on my couch, gripping a baseball bat and willing myself to stay awake. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the attic. My body froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't been in the attic since I moved in, hadn't even unpacked most of the boxes up there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I gripped the bat tighter and crept toward the stairs. Every step felt like a betrayal, the wood groaning beneath me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a single sound broke the stillness. The creak of the attic door opening. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, heart pounding, and sped off without a plan or a destination. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles out of town, I checked my phone for the first time. Dozens of missed calls and texts, all from numbers I didn't recognize. They all said the same thing. "Where are you? The boxes are gone." I didn't respond. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in motels, kept to myself, and avoided the news. But the boxes followed me. The first one appeared in my motel room, tucked under the bed. The photo showed me sleeping, my face peaceful and unaware. The caption read, "They see you." The second one came in a package delivered to the front desk. It showed my car parked outside the motel, a figure barely visible in the back seat. "They're with you." By then, I'd stopped pretending I could escape. There was no running from this, whatever this was. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to Gray Pines. The town was a ghost of itself. Houses were dark, streets empty. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I drove straight to the town square, where a small crowd had gathered around something in the center. It was her, the girl from the photos. She was standing in the middle of the square, barefoot and pale, her hair tangled and wild. Her eyes, too bright, too sharp, met mine the moment I stepped out of the car. "You're late," she said, her voice calm and emotionless. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "You already know." The ground beneath us began to tremble, and I realized with growing horror that the people in the crowd weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were frozen, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths slightly open as if caught mid-scream. "What do you want?" I demanded, my fear giving way to anger. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a particularly interesting insect. "It was never about what I wanted," she said. "It was about what you took." "I don't understand." "You will," she interrupted, stepping closer. Her hand reached out, and for a moment, I thought she was going to touch me. Instead, she pressed something into my palm. It was another Polaroid. This one was blank. "It's your turn," she whispered. The last thing I remember is the flash of the camera. When I woke up, I was alone in the square, clutching the Polaroid. My face stared back at me from the photo, my eyes hollow and unrecognizable. On the back, the caption read, "Find them before they find you." The museum was never supposed to be open that late. By the time I arrived, the city had already folded in on itself, quiet and cold, the streets glistening with the remnants of an earlier rain. The building loomed ahead, its arched windows glowing faintly in the darkness like a lighthouse beckoning lost sailors. I had no reason to be there, at least not one that made sense, but something about the invitation left on my doorstep had unsettled me. It was simple, scrawled on thick, textured paper in ink so dark it looked wet. "Come tonight, midnight. Enter through the staff entrance. Don't tell anyone." I tried to throw it away, twice, but each time, I found myself fishing it back out of the trash, staring at the looping script as if it might rearrange itself into an explanation. It didn't. And now here I was, standing in front of the museum's side door, the note crumpled in my pocket and my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound swallowed by the cavernous darkness inside. The air was colder here, sharper, carrying the faint metallic tang of age. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the hallway ahead of me flickered to life, lit by a series of old-fashioned sconces that buzzed faintly. Their light was weak, barely reaching the corners, but it was enough to guide me forward. The museum was empty, its usual hum of distant voices and shuffling feet replaced by a silence so deep it felt alive. The exhibits I passed seemed unfamiliar, even though I'd visited this place a dozen times before. A taxidermied bird with two mini eyes, a painting that seemed to ripple as I walked by, a statue of a woman whose expression shifted depending on the angle. Each piece felt slightly off, as though they'd been swapped with near-perfect replicas that carried an undercurrent of wrongness. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a man. He was tall, his frame draped in a black coat that brushed the floor, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence pressed against me like a weight. "You came," he said finally, his voice low and resonant, each word carefully measured. I wanted to ask how he knew I would, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, my fingers tightening around the note in my pocket. "Follow me," he said, turning and disappearing around the corner before I could respond. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and pretend the night had never happened. But something about the man, about the invitation, pulled at me, a thread I couldn't help but unravel. I followed. He led me deeper into the museum, through sections I didn't recognize. The air grew colder, the exhibit stranger. One room held a single mirror, its surface rippling like water. Another contained a carousel frozen mid-spin, its painted horses twisted into expressions of terror. The sconces that lit our path became dimmer, their glow tinged with green, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. Finally, we stopped in front of a door. It was small, unremarkable, and so ordinary it felt out of place amid the strangeness. The man stepped aside, gesturing for me to open it. "What's inside?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something you've lost." I stared at him, searching his shadowed face for a clue, but his expression gave nothing away. Slowly, I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. The door creaked open to reveal a room bathed in golden light, its warmth spilling over me like a balm. The space was empty except for a single pedestal in the center. On it rested a glass dome, and beneath the dome was a key. It was simple, unadorned, but something about it felt familiar, like a word on the tip of my tongue or a melody I couldn't quite place. "What is this?" I asked, turning to the man, but he was gone. I stepped into the room, the air thick with something I couldn't name. As I approached the pedestal, the golden light began to shift, darkening at the edges, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I reached out, my hand hovering over the dome, and the key beneath it seemed to hum, vibrating faintly as though it recognized me. The moment I touched the dome, the room changed. The golden light vanished, replaced by a deep, impenetrable blackness. The pedestal dissolved beneath my hand, and the ground disappeared, leaving me suspended in an endless void. Panic clawed at my chest as whispers began to swirl around me, faint and indistinct at first but growing louder, closer. The whispers weren't random. They were voices I recognized. Friends, family, strangers on the street. All speaking words I'd heard before, moments I'd forgotten. They collided and overlapped, forming a cacophony that seemed to press against my skull. And then, one voice cut through the rest, sharp and clear, my own. "You know what you've lost. Take it back." The key appeared in my hand, cold and solid, its weight grounding me in the void. I clutched it tightly, and the whispers fell silent, the darkness receding like a tide. Slowly, the museum returned, its walls and exhibits coming into focus as though I'd stepped out of a dream. The man was waiting for me, his hat tilted slightly, revealing eyes that gleamed like molten gold. "You found it," he said, his tone carrying a hint of approval. "What is it for?" I asked, holding up the key. He smiled, a faint, almost sorrowful expression. "That's for you to decide." Before I could press him further, the lights flickered, and he was gone. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and silent once more. I looked down at the key in my hand, its surface still cool against my skin, and something inside me shifted, a memory, a truth, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The museum doors opened easily when I reached them, the city outside quiet and still. The rain had started again, soft and steady, but I didn't mind. I tucked the key into my pocket and stepped into the night, the invitation burning in my mind. Whatever I'd found, I knew it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. It started with a letter that shouldn't have existed. I found it in my mailbox on a cold, wind-bitten morning, tucked neatly between a grocery store flyer and an electricity bill I didn't want to open. The envelope was yellowed with age, the edges frayed and soft, like it had been handled 1,000 times. My name was written on the front in looping ink that felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't place it. There was no return address, no postmark, just my name, scrawled in deep blue ink. At first, I didn't open it. I stood there in my apartment, holding it in both hands, and stared at it like it might move. There was something off about it, though I couldn't explain why. It was too old, too worn, and yet I could still smell the faint scent of something sweet on it, like violets or vanilla. Finally, curiosity won out, and I slid my thumb under the flap. Inside was a single piece of thick, parchment-like paper. The writing matched the front of the envelope, smooth and careful, as if whoever wrote it had all the time in the world. It read, "You are invited. Tonight, 11:59, 1045 Rue Hollow." That was all it said. No name, no signature, no explanation. I read it 3 times, waiting for it to make sense, but it didn't. I didn't know anyone who lived on Rue Hollow, or even where that street was. When I searched it on my phone, I found nothing, no map, no mention of it online. A street that didn't exist, an invitation from no one. I should have thrown it away right then. Instead, I kept it in my pocket all day. It weighed on me, that scrap of paper, like a stone pressing down in the corner of my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, somehow aware that I hadn't yet made a decision. By the time night fell, I wasn't even surprised to find myself pacing around my apartment, my coat already on, the letter clutched in my hand like a talisman. Just to see, I told myself. I wouldn't stay long. I didn't even know if I'd find anything. At 11:30, I stepped outside. The city felt different at night, sharper, like the world had been cut from darker cloth. The streets were nearly empty, the streetlights buzzing softly as I passed beneath them. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked. My feet seemed to know before I did, turning down alleyways and forgotten streets that twisted like roots beneath the city's skin. I stopped thinking about the time. All I could hear was the rhythm of my shoes tapping against the pavement and the faint, far-off hum of something I couldn't name. At exactly 11:59, I found it. 1045 Rue Hollow wasn't a house or an apartment building. It wasn't even a proper address. It was an archway, tall and narrow, set into the crumbling brick wall of an old building I didn't recognize. Vines crawled up the edges, winding around the stone as if they'd been growing there for centuries. A single lantern hung above the arch, casting golden light that pooled on the ground like liquid. Beyond the arch, I could see steps leading down. I hesitated. There was no sign, no voice, nothing to indicate I was in the right place. But the air smelled faintly of violets, just like the letter, and that seemed reason enough. Without thinking, I stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the city vanished. The sounds of distant traffic disappeared, replaced by something else. Music, gentle, lilting, like an old record spinning on a gramophone. The steps led me downward, spiraling gently until I reached the bottom. The room I stepped into didn't belong underground. It didn't belong anywhere I'd ever seen. It was a grand ballroom, vast and endless, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. Crystal chandeliers hung above me, their lights flickering like stars, and the floor was marble, polished to a gleam that reflected the world upside down. People were everywhere, dancing, laughing, spinning in circles like planets caught in orbit. But they weren't like me. They wore clothes that didn't belong to this century, velvet gowns and sharp, tailored suits, lace collars and intricate masks that covered their faces. Some masks were delicate, golden filigree and feathers, while others were grotesque, twisted into snarling animals or empty-eyed harlequins. The people moved like shadows, too smooth, too quiet, their laughter slipping through the air like silk. A man with a fox mask appeared at my side. I didn't see him approach. He was just there, offering me a glass of something dark and sparkling. "You came," he said. His voice was low, almost musical. I was beginning to wonder. I started, but words escaped me. He tilted his head. "Not many get the invitation, you know. Fewer still accept it." I took the glass from him because it felt like I had to, though I didn't drink it. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, like it held stars trapped in its depths. "Where am I?" I asked. The man laughed softly, showing sharp, white teeth beneath his mask. "Don't ask questions you aren't ready to answer." Before I could respond, he disappeared into the crowd, melting into the dance as though he'd never existed. I stood there, clutching the glass, the music pulling at the edges of my thoughts. Everything about the room felt heavy and timeless, like I'd stepped into a storybook someone had forgotten to close. I walked through the ballroom, feeling every eye on me, though no one seemed to look directly at me. There were no mirrors, and yet I caught glimpses of myself, reflected in polished silver trays, in the gleam of a crystal goblet, and I looked different. My clothes were no longer mine. I was wearing something black and soft, a coat that buttoned high on my neck, boots that clicked against the marble floor. I felt like someone else entirely, someone braver and stranger than I'd ever been. As I reached the center of the room, the music stopped. The dancers froze mid-step, their heads turning toward me in unison. My breath caught. A woman stood at the far end of the ballroom, a throne of twisted black iron rising behind her. She wore a mask made of bone, smooth and white, with hollowed-out eyes that watched me too closely. "You're late," she said, her voice echoing through the silence. "I don't understand," I whispered. She tilted her head, and the mask seemed to smile. "You will." The chandeliers flickered. The shadows on the walls began to move, stretching and twisting toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The woman raised her hand, and the glass in mine shattered, spilling its starry liquid across the floor. The music started again, louder this time, frenetic and wild. The dancers resumed their steps, spinning faster and faster as the shadows swallowed the room. And then I was falling. I woke up in my bed. The letter was gone. The only proof that any of it had happened was a thin line of gold dust smeared across my palm, glittering faintly in the morning light. I haven't heard the music again, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the bone-white mask and hear laughter echoing somewhere far away. I don't know how I found the ballroom, or why I was invited, but I know one thing. I wasn't supposed to leave. Let me set the scene. It's 3 a.m., and I'm sitting on my couch eating cereal straight out of the box while binge-watching The Great British Bake Off for reasons I still don't fully understand. My apartment is quiet except for the hum of my fridge and the occasional sound of my upstairs neighbor stomping around like he's training for a tap dancing competition. Everything's normal, chill, boring, even. And then, out of nowhere, my TV screen goes black. Not like the power went out. Everything else was still on, but like someone had turned off Paul Hollywood mid-sentence. Naturally, I yelled, "Hey!" at the screen, as though the universe cared about my need for televised pastries. But before I could grab the remote, this message appeared in bold, white letters. "Player 1, your game is ready." For a second, I just stared at it, confused. Player 1? I mean, I'm not much of a gamer unless you count Candy Crush, and even then, I'm stuck on a level I've been playing since last summer. I was about to blame a weird Netflix glitch when the text changed. Press start to begin. And then, my remote, the remote I wasn't touching, clicked on its own. The next thing I know, the room starts to dissolve. Not like in any of the walls are melting, call 911 kind of way, but more like everything was pixelating. My couch, my coffee table, even the cereal box in my lap. all of it breaking apart into tiny, glowing squares and floating away. And before I could scream or do anything remotely useful, the ground disappeared, too, and I fell. But I didn't just fall. I landed, hard, on something soft and squishy, like a giant marshmallow. When I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in, well, I don't even know what to call it. A forest? A jungle? Imagine if a nature documentary exploded into a kaleidoscope and sprinkled glitter on everything. The trees were massive and glowing, their trunks twisting up into a sky full of swirling neon clouds. The ground was covered in what looked like grass, except it shimmered and changed colors when you stepped on it. And in the distance, I saw a mountain shaped like a giant hand, its fingers curling up into the sky like it was trying to catch the stars. That's when I noticed the HUD. Yes, a HUD. A little glowing display floating in the corner of my vision, like I'd stepped into a video game. It said, Level 1. The beginning of everything. Objective, find the orb. Before I could process what any of that meant, a voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere at once. It sounded suspiciously like Morgan Freeman, but if Morgan Freeman had a sore throat. Welcome, Player 1, it said. You have been chosen for the game. The what? I yelled back, spinning in a circle like a lunatic. What game? I didn't sign up for anything. Your consent was implied when you sat on the couch, the voice said flatly. What kind of nonsense? I started. But before I could finish, the voice cut me off. Complete the objectives, or face deletion. Deletion? I squeaked. Like, dying? You mean actual dying? The voice didn't answer. Instead, my HUD updated with a blinking arrow pointing deeper into the glowing forest. And because I didn't have a better plan, and because deletion sounded like a situation I didn't want to explore, I followed it. The forest was wild. Literally, everything moved. The trees whispered secrets to each other in a language I couldn't understand. The flowers swayed like they were grooving to some cosmic music only they could hear. At one point, a bird flew by with wings made of fire, and it squawked at me like I'd offended its ancestors. The whole place felt alive, and not in a chill, nature is beautiful way. More like an I'm being watched and judged by everything around me way. About 20 minutes in, I found my first challenge. And by challenge, I mean a 7-foot-tall mushroom with googly eyes and a deep, rumbling laugh. It stomped into my path, crossing its arms, stalks, whatever mushrooms have. You seek the orb, it bellowed. You must defeat me first. Defeat you how? I asked, fully expecting some kind of epic battle involving swords or magic spells. Riddle me this, it roared. I blinked. Wait, riddles? That's it? The mushroom frowned, looking deeply offended. I am very good at riddles. Okay, sure. Hit me with your best shot. It took a deep breath, or whatever mushrooms do to prepare themselves, and said, What has roots as nobody sees? Is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, and yet it never grows? Easy. A mountain, I said. The mushroom froze. Its googly eyes swiveled around like it couldn't believe I'd actually gotten it right. Lucky guess, it muttered, before shrinking down into the ground and disappearing in a puff of smoke. I was feeling pretty smug until the voice came back, louder than ever. Player 1 has cleared Challenge 1. Time remaining, 4 hours. 4 hours. I yelled. For what? What happens if I don't finish? Deletion, the voice reminded me, as though I'd forgotten. The next few hours were a blur of weirdness. I fought a sentient river that tried to drown me in jellyfish. I played a high-stakes game of chess with a fox that cheated so blatantly it actually gave me tips mid-match. I even ended up in a dance-off with a swarm of fireflies, which I'm proud to say I won, though it left me deeply winded and questioning every decision that had led to this moment. Finally, I reached the mountain hand thing. My HUD updated again. Final objective, claim the orb. There it was at the mountain's peak, a glowing, pulsating sphere that seemed to hum with power. The only problem? Between me and the orb was a staircase that appeared to defy physics. It twisted and turned, folding in on itself like an M.C. Escher painting. Every step glowed faintly, and as I started climbing, the stairs moved beneath my feet, forcing me to jump from one to the next like a deranged game of hopscotch. By the time I reached the top, I was panting so hard I could barely see straight. But there it was, the orb, hovering in midair, casting golden light across the summit. I reached out to grab it, half expecting it to zap me into oblivion. Instead, it spoke. "Congratulations, Player 1. You have completed the tutorial." "Tutorial?" I yelled. "You're telling me all that was just a warm-up?" The orb pulsed, almost like it was laughing. "Welcome to level 2. And just like that, the ground vanished beneath me, and I was falling again. So yeah, that's how I ended up trapped in what I'm pretty sure is the most stressful video game ever made. If you were sucked into a game where deletion was on the table, would you even play? Or just sit there and hope for a glitch to save you? Asking for a friend. I woke up to find my shadow had left a note. It was scrawled across the bedroom wall in looping, inky handwriting. "Gone exploring. Don't wait up." My first thought was, how does a shadow write a note? My second thought was, what does a shadow even explore? The third thought didn't arrive because the lamp beside my bed chuckled, breaking my train of thought. "Shadows are always restless," it said, flickering its light in amusement. "They don't like being tied down. You can't blame it, really." I stared at the empty patch of carpet where my shadow should have been inside. "Well, that's inconvenient." The lamp winked at me. "Most things are." When I stepped into the hallway, I realized my reflection had also gone rogue. Every mirror in the house was empty, not just blank, but actively avoiding eye contact. When I passed the bathroom, the mirror flinched and tilted itself away from me. "Seriously?" I asked. "Can't talk," it muttered. "Union rules." The kitchen was in an unhelpful mood as well. My toaster was locked in a heated debate with the bread about who had the harder job. The bread was claiming it endured existential dread from being trapped in plastic. The toaster was arguing that bread didn't understand the pressures of perfection. I decided breakfast wasn't worth the drama and poured myself a glass of orange juice instead. The juice, freshly liberated from the fridge, bubbled happily in my glass, but it also kept humming snippets of a song I didn't recognize. "Who wrote that?" I asked. "The oranges," it replied, as if this were obvious. Outside, the world was unraveling in slow, mesmerizing waves. The sun hung lower than usual, the size of a grapefruit, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. None of them were mine, of course. Mine was still exploring. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, though I couldn't see any logical source. Birds darted through the sky in shapes too precise to be accidental. An arrow, a heart, a question mark, and then scattered into the clouds like spilled ink. At the end of the driveway, my neighbor's mailbox was standing on its tiptoes, desperately trying to reach the sky. "It's been practicing for weeks," said my neighbor, who was watering her lawn with what appeared to be a sentient watering can. "Hasn't quite nailed the jump yet." The mailbox gave a hopeful little leap, landed with a soft clang, and sighed. "One day," it muttered, shaking itself off. On my walk, the world grew even stranger. The sidewalk tiles were swapping places like pieces of a sliding puzzle, forcing me to adjust my steps mid-stride. A newspaper on the ground flapped its pages and whispered, "Want to know a secret?" "Sure," I said, kneeling down. The newspaper leaned closer. "Everything you're looking for is somewhere you've already been." I blinked. "That's not helpful." "Secrets rarely are," it replied, folding itself neatly and hopping away. At the park, the pond had turned into something closer to a dream. The water didn't ripple or reflect. It shimmered like the surface of a mirror, but deeper, as though it contained layers of hidden stories. People were clustered around it, tossing in objects like offerings. Keys, photos, a pair of ballet shoes. Each time something sank, the pond responded. A couple threw in a gold ring, and a small wooden boat rose from the water's surface, carrying tiny passengers that waved as it drifted off. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an old movie ticket stub, one I'd kept for no particular reason. On impulse, I flicked it into the water. The pond stilled for a moment, then burst into motion. 1,000 tiny moths, glowing softly, erupted from its depths and swirled around me before vanishing into the sky. What does that mean? I asked a nearby bench, which had been quietly observing the whole scene. Maybe nothing, it said, its wooden slats creaking thoughtfully. Maybe everything. Further down the park, I found a gathering of people sitting in a circle, listening intently to a single blade of grass. The grass was lecturing on the importance of stillness, its voice barely a whisper, but somehow carrying across the clearing. To grow, it said, you must first remember how to be. A fox in a velvet waistcoat leaned against a tree nearby, rolling its eyes. Grass always makes it sound so profound, it said, its voice rich and smooth. But honestly, stillness is just laziness in a pretty coat. What would you recommend then? I asked. Running, the fox replied, snapping its teeth, fast and far, until you forget what you were running from. The ground beneath us trembled faintly, and I glanced down to see the earth cracking open. Flowers spilled out, not weeds or wildflowers, but fully grown sunflowers, their faces wide and grinning. They sprouted like they'd been waiting for this exact moment, bending toward me in unison. Good timing, one said. Thanks? I replied, unsure what I'd done to deserve their approval. When I got home, the house had rearranged itself again. My shadow was back, lounging casually across the living room wall. How was your day? It asked, its tone infuriatingly smug. Confusing, I said. Where did you even go? It shrugged. Here and there. Found some old memories. Borrowed a couple of dreams. You'd be surprised what you leave behind. I'd like to be less surprised, honestly. My shadow laughed, a low, rippling sound. Then you're living in the wrong kind of world. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the galaxies above me swirled with lazy intent. A shooting star darted across the ceiling, and as I watched it, my shadow murmured from the wall. What would you chase if you knew you couldn't fail? I didn't answer. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the world fold itself around me, strange and full of secrets I wasn't ready to understand. Here's the story of how I accidentally created a cult. To clarify, it wasn't a real cult, not at first, anyway. It was more of a running joke that got wildly out of hand. But by the end, I was wearing a cape and being called the Shepherd. So, yeah, things escalated. It started at work. I'd been at my office job for about 6 months, the kind of job where your soul goes to take a nap while you pretend spreadsheets are fulfilling. The only bright spot was my cubicle neighbor, Dave. Dave had this dry, deadpan humor that made even the most boring tasks feel like an inside joke. One Tuesday, during a particularly mind-numbing quarterly update meeting, I leaned over and whispered, I think this is how people accidentally start cults. 1 minute they're bored, the next they're handing out robes and chanting. Without missing a beat, Dave said, if you start one, I'm in. But I'm not drinking any weird Kool-Aid. It was just a joke. That's important to note. But then, over the next few weeks, it became a running gag between us. Every time something ridiculous happened at work, a surprise deadline, a passive-aggressive email from upper management, the Wi-Fi going down, we'd whisper, this is why we need the cult. Other coworkers started catching on, and before I knew it, the cult had become shorthand for our collective misery. Then someone, I'm pretty sure it was Linda from HR, made a joke in the break room about how the cult needed a manifesto. So, during a particularly dull Friday afternoon, I wrote one. It was just a one-page document titled, The Cult of Better Days, filled with nonsense rules like 1. No meetings longer than 20 minutes unless snacks are provided. 2. Thursdays are sacred pajama days, pants optional. 3. All members must agree that Susan's tuna casserole smells like regret and sadness. I printed it out, slapped it on the communal bulletin board, and figured that would be the end of it. But I underestimated the power of collective boredom. By Monday, someone had turned the manifesto into a laminated poster and hung it in the break room next to the coffee machine. Another coworker had designed a logo, a simple circle with a coffee mug in the center and the words Better Days scrawled underneath in Comic Sans. Someone else started handing out stickers with the logo on them, which people started putting on their laptops and water bottles. I walked into work one morning to find Dave staring at me, wide-eyed, holding a Better Days mug that someone had custom ordered. "You've created a movement," he said. At first, it was funny. People started referring to themselves as disciples, and someone made a Slack channel called #the Cult of Better Days, where we posted memes about office life and vented about Karen and accounting. But then things got weird. One day, during a team-building exercise, the kind where everyone pretends they don't hate team-building exercises, someone stood up and said, "I think the cult should have a leader." Everyone laughed, but then Dave pointed at me and said, "Well, it's obviously my name. They're the founder." Founder quickly turned into Shepherd, because apparently cults need dramatic titles. I played along because, hey, it was funny. But before I knew it, people were treating me like I was genuinely in charge. Someone made me a cape, an actual, floor-length black cape with the Better Days logo embroidered on the back. Linda from HR, remember her? Started calling me, "Oh Great Shepherd," in meetings, completely straight-faced. Then came the rituals. It started small. One Friday, we all decided to wear the same color, blue, as a joke. But the next week, people started coordinating outfits without me even suggesting it. We all wore flannel one Thursday to honor Sacred Pajama Day. Someone brought donuts and claimed it was an offering to the shepherd. People started high-fiving each other in the break room while chanting "Better Days," like it was some kind of battle cry. I could barely keep a straight face. But then, one day, Susan, yes, the tuna casserole Susan, came up to me and asked, "Shepherd, do you think the cult could organize a coffee fund?" I thought she was kidding, so I said, "Yeah, sure, Susan. Let's start a coffee tithe." By the end of the week, people were literally Venmoing me $5 to support the sacred brew. I didn't know how to stop it. And honestly, I didn't want to stop it. Work was actually fun for once. People were laughing, collaborating, and bonding over this absurd inside joke. Productivity even went up because everyone was in such a good mood. Management took notice, and I started getting these cryptic emails from higher-ups saying things like, "Whatever you're doing, keep it up, but all good things must come to an end." The tipping point came during the quarterly all-staff meeting. Someone, no one would admit who, changed the slide deck's title from Q3 Updates to Better Days, The Rise of the Cult. When the CEO clicked on the first slide, it was a gif of me, in my cape, holding a mug of coffee like it was the Holy Grail. The entire room erupted in laughter. The CEO did not. By the next day, Linda from HR called me into her office. "So," she began, folding her hands, "about this cult." She was trying not to laugh, but it was clear that someone from corporate had asked her to address it. I explained that it was all a joke, just a harmless way to boost morale. She nodded and said, "Right? Just maybe tone it down before someone from legal hears about it." And that was it. The cult of Better Days didn't die overnight, but it slowly faded back into a casual joke. People stopped wearing coordinated outfits. The cape disappeared, and while the stickers and mugs stuck around, the rituals quietly faded. Still, every once in a while, someone will walk past my desk, give me a knowing nod, and whisper, "Better Days." And I'll nod back, because for a brief, glorious moment, we were more than just co-workers. We were something bigger, something ridiculous, and something strangely meaningful. So, have you ever started something as a joke, only to have it spiral into something much bigger than you ever imagined? Because trust me, I know exactly how that feels. When I woke up this morning, the air was humming. Not like the faint hum of a fridge or a heater. No, this was a deep, resonant hum. Like the universe itself was clearing its throat. I thought it was just in my head, the remnants of some dream I couldn't remember, but then my bedside lamp leaned toward me. Yes, leaned. The neck of it curved slightly, almost like a bow. "Good morning," it said, voice warm and metallic, like a cello string being plucked. "Finally decided to rejoin the living, huh?" I froze. I'm not a morning person at the best of times, but having your lamp greet you like a butler on its day off is the kind of thing that scrambles your brain. I managed, staring at the lamp. It clicked its bulb off and back on again, like a wink. "You've got a long day ahead of you. Might want to get moving before the couch starts ranting." The couch? What? I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and the floor groaned beneath my weight. Not in the creaky, normal way, but in a distinctly fed-up tone. Honestly, it muttered, "Do you ever consider slippers? Cold feet all over me, first thing in the morning. Every day." I yelped, nearly tripping as I scrambled to my feet. The floorboards chuckled, a low, wooden rumble that felt weirdly smug. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I was bracing for impact. Sure enough, as soon as I opened the fridge, it let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Still standing there with the door open," it said, voice dripping with judgment. "Do I look like an air conditioner to you? No, seriously. Take your time. Let all the cold out. I'll just work twice as hard. No big deal." I snatched the milk carton, but that only made things worse. "Oh, sure," said the milk, its tone acidic and bitter, like it had been stewing on this for years. "Pick me up when you need me, but ignore me for days when I'm just sitting here." Typical. Juniper, my cat, sauntered in at that moment, tail flicking lazily. She sat down in the doorway and yawned, an impressive display of nonchalance. "So, you can hear them now?" "Hear what?" I stammered. "Everything," she said, licking her paw. "The objects. The house. Me, obviously. You finally tuned in." "Tuned in? What does that even mean?" Juniper gave me a pitying look. "It means you're no longer as clueless as most humans. Congrats. You're catching up." Before I could respond, the coffee maker sputtered indignantly. "Don't just stand there," it snapped. "I'm not going to brew myself." I fumbled with the machine, pouring water into the reservoir, my hands shaking. "Okay, this is weird. What's going on? Am I losing my mind?" "Not losing," Juniper said. "Finding, maybe." The toaster popped up empty, startling me. "Let's not make this about you," it said, voice raspy like a chain smoker who'd retired to a beach town. "We've been dealing with your nonsense for years, and now you finally hear us. Welcome to the party." By mid-morning, I had resigned myself to the fact that my house was, for lack of a better word, alive. My favorite chair complained about my bad posture. The bathroom sink had strong opinions about toothpaste residue. A rinse wouldn't kill you. Even my socks got involved, grumbling about being shoved into the back of the drawer. The weirdest part? Outside wasn't any quieter. The trees were murmuring to each other, their voices creaky and ancient. "Wind's picking up," one said. "Leaves rustling like an old man clearing his throat. Rain's coming." "No kidding," replied a younger sapling. "We've been feeling it for hours. Try to keep up." The streetlights, stoic and tall, grumbled about pigeons. "No respect," one muttered as a bird swooped past. And then there were the squirrels. "Oh, the squirrels. Hey, you got any snacks?" One yelled at me from the power line. His voice was high-pitched and frantic, like someone who'd just chugged 3 energy drinks. "Seeds? Nuts? Anything?" "She doesn't feed us," another squirrel chimed in, shaking his tiny head in disappointment. "She's stingy. Classic human." "I can hear you," I called out, unsure if I should laugh or scream. "Yeah, and?" the first squirrel shot back. "Still no snacks, though." I made the mistake of walking to the park to clear my head. That's when I realized everything was in on this. The swings creaked melodramatically, complaining about how kids never use them gently anymore. The fountain burbled with an air of superiority, bragging about how it was the crown jewel of the park. Even the benches got involved, bemoaning how often people carved their initials into them. By the time I got home, I was completely overwhelmed. I collapsed onto the couch, which let out an offended huff. "Oh great," it said. "Back to your usual spot. Do I look like a corner to you? I have other cushions, you know." "Sorry," I muttered, sliding to the middle. "Better," the couch said, though it still sounded miffed. Juniper leapt onto my lap and purred softly. "You'll get used to it," she said. "Used to what?" "Being part of the conversation," she replied. "It's not so bad once you stop fighting it. Everything around you has been alive all along. You're just finally paying attention." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The fan, spinning lazily above, chimed in with a chuckle. "She's right, you know. We've been here the whole time. Watching. Waiting. Listening. Listening to what? I asked, feeling a twinge of unease. Everything, said the fan. We know more about you than you know about yourself. I couldn't tell if that was comforting or terrifying, but as the day wore on, I realized it wasn't all bad. The objects, the house, the world around me, they weren't out to get me. They were just there, observing, living in their own strange way. As I climbed into bed that night, the comforter draped over me like a protective cocoon. Good night, it murmured, soft and warm. Don't let the bedbugs bite, added the mattress deadpan. Juniper curled up at my feet, her tail twitching. See? It's not so bad, she said. And weirdly enough, she was right. If you woke up one day and could hear the whole world talking, your furniture, your clothes, even the trees outside, would you want to know what they had to say? Or would you turn it all off and go back to ignorance? Because honestly, I think I'm starting to like the noise. The first time I saw the door, it was on the side of an abandoned warehouse near the river, a place no one ever went, unless they had a death wish or a strong tolerance for tetanus. It was painted deep red, with a brass handle that gleamed like it had been polished just yesterday, which was odd because the rest of the building looked like it was losing a fight with gravity. The door didn't belong there, and that's exactly why I couldn't walk away. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I'd take a quick peek, and if it looked sketchy, of course it would. I'd leave, but the closer I got, the more the air seemed to shift. The usual stink of river sludge and mildew faded, replaced by something sweet, like honeysuckle on a summer night. And the warehouse, this ugly, crumbling beast of a building, seemed to quiet down. Its usual groans and creaks hushed like it was holding its breath. I reached for the handle. It was warm under my fingers, like it had been sitting in the sun, though the sky was overcast. I hesitated, a small voice in my head screaming that this was a bad idea. Then I turned the handle, and the door opened with a click that sounded almost like a sigh. The first thing I noticed was the light. Soft, golden, the kind that spills through lace curtains on a lazy Sunday morning. It poured out of the doorway, pooling at my feet, and beyond it, I could see a hallway. Not the inside of a warehouse, not even close. Just a long, narrow hallway lined with intricate wallpaper in a deep, forest green. A runner carpet stretched down the middle, leading to another door at the far end, this one a shimmering silver. I didn't step inside right away. I poked my head through, half expecting someone to yell at me or a trap to spring. But the hallway was silent, waiting. When I pulled my head back, the red door was still there, solid and unassuming. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door behind me slammed shut, disappearing into the wallpaper like it had never been there. My stomach dropped. I turned in a circle, looking for some kind of seam or edge, but the wall was smooth, seamless. Okay, cool, I muttered to myself. This is fine. Totally normal. The air in the hallway was thick with the scent of lavender and something earthier, like freshly tilled soil. And as I took a few cautious steps forward, I noticed the sound. A low hum, steady and rhythmic, almost like breathing. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a soft inhale, exhale, like the hallway was alive. I made my way toward the silver door at the end, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. When I reached it, I noticed a small inscription etched into the doorframe, written in a language I didn't recognize. The letters shimmered faintly, as if they were alive too. Without thinking, I reached for the silver handle and turned it. The door didn't open into another room. It opened into the sky. I was standing on a platform that floated in the middle of nothing, a vast, endless expanse of stars and swirling galaxies. The platform was made of smooth black stone, its edges carved into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow if I looked at them for too long. Suspended in the air above the platform was a massive hourglass. Its frame was made of twisting, golden vines, and the sand inside wasn't sand at all. It was liquid light, glowing and swirling as it trickled from one chamber to the other. I wasn't alone. Standing at the base of the hourglass was a figure cloaked in shadow, their form rippling like smoke. They turned as I stepped onto the platform, and though their face was hidden, I could feel their gaze, sharp and heavy, like it could peel away layers of my soul. "You're late," they said, their voice low and smooth, carrying a weight that made me shiver. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice sounding small and distant. They tilted their head, studying me. "You opened the door. That makes you a player." "A player?" They gestured toward the hourglass. "The game begins when the last grain of light falls. Win, and you'll leave with more than you can imagine. Lose, and well..." They didn't finish the sentence, but the air around them seemed to grow colder, and I got the distinct impression that losing wasn't an option I wanted to explore. Before I could ask more questions, the last drop of light fell, and the hourglass vanished. The platform beneath me shifted, breaking apart into floating tiles that rearranged themselves into a staircase spiraling upward into the void. "Climb," the figure said. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. They smiled, at least, I think they did. The air around them rippled faintly, like heat rising off asphalt. "Then you'll stay here. Forever." That was enough for me. I started climbing. The staircase wasn't just a staircase. Each step brought a new challenge. On one, I had to solve a riddle that seemed to echo inside my head, twisting my own thoughts against me. On another, I found myself walking through a memory I'd long buried. One I would have preferred to leave buried. The tiles shifted and cracked beneath my feet, the path always changing, always threatening to fall away if I hesitated. The further I climbed, the stranger things became. Time seemed to warp, stretching and collapsing in on itself. I passed other players, some climbing, some stuck on a single step, their faces pale and haunted. A few were just gone, their tiles empty, their absence a quiet warning. Eventually, I reached the top, or what I thought was the top. The final step led to another door, this one black as night and etched with a single word: choose. The figure from before was waiting, their shadowy form more solid now, their presence heavier. "This is your final task," they said. "What do I have to do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Choose a door." They gestured, and suddenly, the black door split into two. One glowed with a soft, golden light, warm and inviting. The other pulsed with a deep, crimson energy, sharp and dangerous. "What's behind them?" "That," they said, "depends on you." I stared at the doors, my mind racing. One was safe. The other was risk. Or maybe that's what they wanted me to think. Maybe the golden door was a trap, and the crimson door was the way out. Or maybe neither was safe, and this was the real test, knowing when to walk away. I turned to the figure, but they were already fading, their form dissolving into smoke. "Choose," their voice echoed one last time, and then they were gone. I reached for the handle, heart pounding, and made my choice. The door opened, and the world changed forever. Have you ever stumbled into something that felt bigger than yourself? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Not the ticking kind that hangs on walls or rests beside beds, but a massive, intricate tower that had appeared overnight in the middle of the city square. No one knew where it had come from. One day, there was nothing but the cracked concrete of the plaza, and the next, there it stood, looming, otherworldly, and completely out of place. Its face was dark glass, its hands etched with golden filigree, and gears that seemed to move without sound. I first saw it on my way to work. The morning buzz of commuters slowed to a stunned crawl around it. People stopped in clusters, necks craned, whispering in awe. Some took pictures, but the images came out blurred and distorted, as if the clock resisted being captured. The strangest thing, though, was the time it showed, 13:13. Not a minute more, not a second less. No one could agree on what it meant. Was it an art installation? A prank? A strange marketing stunt? The city officials issued statements that explained nothing, only promising they'd look into it. And then the rumors started. Stories about people who lingered near the clock too long and disappeared. I didn't think much of it. It was weird, sure, but the world was full of weird things. I passed it every day, barely sparing it a glance. Until the night the clock struck 13:13 for real. I had worked late, the office long emptied, and the streets were eerily quiet as I made my way home. The clock was glowing faintly in the square, its golden hands gleaming even in the dark. Something about it stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the sound. A deep, resonant thrumming filled the air, like a heartbeat amplified through the bones of the earth. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate, and for a moment, it felt as though the city itself had taken a breath. The clock's glass face shimmered, and the hands began to move. Slowly, agonizingly, they ticked backward, winding away from 13:13 toward 12 o'clock. I don't know why I stayed to watch. Maybe it was the pull of something unknown, something my mind couldn't explain. When the clock hit midnight, the thrumming stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Then, the door appeared. It slid open silently at the base of the clock, a narrow archway revealing a spiral staircase that wound downward into the dark. I should have run. I should have turned around and walked home and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But instead, I stepped forward, drawn by a force I couldn't name. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of metal and earth. The stairs spiraled endlessly, the faint glow of the clock's golden gears lighting my way. By the time I reached the bottom, I was sure I'd left the world entirely. I stepped into a cavernous hall, its walls lined with massive cogs and spinning machinery that looked too ancient and intricate to have been made by human hands. The floor was polished obsidian, reflecting faint, shifting patterns of light from above. In the center of the room stood a table, and at that table sat 3 figures. They were robed in deep, shimmering black, their faces obscured by hoods. Between them, on the table, rested an hourglass. But the sand inside wasn't falling. It was rising, swirling upward in defiance of gravity, glittering like crushed diamonds. "Welcome," one of the figures said, their voice layered, as if many voices were speaking at once. "You've come to make a choice." "A choice?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vast space. Another figure leaned forward slightly. "Everyone who comes here chooses," they said. "Time has brought you to this place. What you do next determines where it takes you." "I don't understand," I said, but they only gestured to the hourglass. "Flip it," the third figure said. Their tone wasn't unkind, but it held the weight of inevitability. "Once you do, you'll see." I hesitated. The room felt alive, humming with energy that made my skin prickle. I could feel their unseen eyes on me, waiting, expectant. The hourglass sat there, delicate and impossibly fragile, its sand twisting in a mesmerizing dance. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. The first figure tilted their head. "Nothing. You return to your life as it was. Ordinary. Unchanged." "And if I do?" The second figure's hood seemed to shift, as if they were smiling beneath it. "You'll go where time has been waiting to take you." I don't know why I believed them, but I did. My hand moved before I could second-guess myself, and I grasped the hourglass by its slim neck. It was warm, thrumming faintly like a living thing. I flipped it over. The effect was immediate. The sand exploded outward in a shower of light, filling the room with swirling patterns that danced across the walls and ceiling. The figures disappeared, and the table vanished beneath me. I was falling, not downward, but through time itself. Memories and moments flickered around me. A childhood summer spent chasing fireflies, the dull ache of a broken heart, the exhilaration of a long-forgotten victory. And then, just as suddenly, I was standing in the middle of a street I didn't recognize. The city was alive, but it wasn't the city I knew. The buildings were sleek and strange, their surfaces gleaming like liquid metal. The air buzzed with the hum of technology one couldn't comprehend, and people moved past me in flashes of color, their faces obscured by strange, shifting masks. I wandered, overwhelmed, until I found myself standing before another clock tower. This one was taller, grander, its face glowing faintly with the same golden light as the first. Beneath it, a new door waited. I realized then that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The clock hadn't sent me to a destination. It had set me on a journey, and I had no idea where it would lead. The hum began again, deep and resonant, as the clock's hands started to move. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped through the door and let time take me. The other night, I found myself staring at the moon. not for any deep or poetic reason, but because I was trying to use it as a landmark while figuring out where my food delivery guy had gone. The map on my phone showed him drifting vaguely in my direction, like a digital ghost wandering the afterlife, but he kept making inexplicable detours. At one point, he seemed to have stopped at a gas station, which felt like a betrayal. "You had one job, Alex." I even texted him, "Everything okay?" but got no reply. For a moment, I wondered if he was lost, or perhaps abducted by aliens. Then again, if I just spent 20 minutes navigating my city's endless maze of one-way streets while trying not to spill someone's pad thai, I'd ignore texts too. As I waited for Alex to rediscover my coordinates, I started thinking about how insane this entire concept is. I pressed a button on my phone, and now someone I've never met is wandering the night to bring me noodles. Like some kind of 21st century food courier night. It's absurd, isn't it? Yet here I was, fully reliant on this invisible web of apps, maps, and strangers, like it's the most normal thing in the world. 10 years ago, if you told me people would regularly pay strangers to fetch bubble tea, I'd have laughed. Now, I don't just expect it. I get annoyed if my driver takes a route that's 2 minutes longer than necessary. "How dare you, Alex? My curry is lukewarm." Eventually, Alex arrived, looking thoroughly unimpressed by my enthusiastic, "Thank you so much." I couldn't tell if he was exhausted from the delivery grind or just baffled by why anyone would order soup at 11 p.m. Either way, he handed me the bag, gave a curt nod, and drove off into the night, leaving me alone with my very mild existential dread. I brought the food inside and immediately dropped my chopsticks on the floor, which felt symbolic somehow. This is what adulthood is, isn't it? Trying to be fancy with takeout, only to eat noodles with a fork because you can't be bothered to wash another pair of utensils. As I ate, I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, because God forbid I let my brain experience a single moment of silence, and stumbled across a series of videos about minimalist living. You know the type. Serene people in neutral-toned clothing extolling the virtues of decluttering while sipping from glass cups that definitely don't come in a pack of 12 at Target. One woman, sitting in an aggressively white room, talked about how she'd reduced her life to just the essentials: a bed, a chair, and one fork. One fork. I stared at my couch, where 3 mismatched throw blankets had formed some kind of textile colony, and wondered if I, too, should aspire to this monastic existence. But then I looked at my coffee table, crowded with candles, books I hadn't read, and a decorative bowl of seashells I bought in a fit of whimsy, and thought, no, I like my chaos. It's like living in a museum of my own bad decisions. Every object tells a story. The seashells from that one time I decided I'd become a coastal decor person, the half-burned candle that smells like pine trees because I thought it would trick me into feeling outdoorsy, the ancient remote control I refused to throw away because what if it works for something? Minimalism might look pretty on Instagram, but clutter is where the memories live. Feeling defiant, I decided to clean my desk because nothing says I'm rejecting societal expectations like alphabetizing your pins. As I sorted through piles of sticky notes with illegible scrawls, I came across an old fortune cookie slip that read, "You will find your greatest fortune in unexpected places." I laughed, because I'd once taken that seriously enough to stick it in my wallet for 3 months, hoping it was about money. It wasn't. The greatest fortune I'd found that year was a perfect parking spot outside a concert venue, which, admittedly, did feel like divine intervention. Still, it made me think about how we're always hunting for meaning in the weirdest places. Horoscopes, tarot cards, the way your barista spells your name wrong but only slightly wrong. Humans are pattern seekers by nature. It's how we find hope in chaos, or at least justify buying another scented candle because it's a sign. I spent the next hour spiraling down a mental rabbit hole, wondering if my life was actually full of secret signs I'd been missing. Maybe the constant appearance of the number 22 in my life meant something. Or maybe it was just that I like to order pad thai for $22. Either way, I was committed now. I spent the rest of the evening Googling things like how to recognize universal synchronicity and what does it mean if crows stare at you, even though the only crows in my life are the ones near the dumpster behind my apartment. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I felt both overwhelmed and weirdly excited. like I was standing on the edge of some cosmic revelation that was just out of reach. And then, as I closed my eyes, I heard a loud ding from my phone. It was Alex. He'd accidentally left his AirPods in my delivery bag and wanted to know if he could come back to grab them. I agreed, of course, though part of me couldn't help but think, was this the sign I'd been looking for? When Alex showed up at my door again, we both laughed at the absurdity of the situation. He grabbed his AirPods, muttered something about long night, and left without much fanfare. But for a brief moment, I stood there, holding the door open and feeling like something oddly meaningful had just happened. Maybe the universe was trying to tell me something after all, even if it was just this. Sometimes the little detours, like forgotten AirPods or lukewarm curry, are what make life interesting. What's a strange, random moment in your life that made you pause and think, maybe there's more to this than I realized? I woke up to find a clock embedded in my chest, not strapped on like a watch, not tattooed like a rebellious bad decision. Embedded, ticking softly beneath my skin. It was old-fashioned, with brass hands and Roman numerals, the kind of clock you'd find in your grandmother's attic. Except this one wasn't in an attic. It was in me. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the soft tick-tock blending with the frantic thudding of my heart. The clock ticked slower than my pulse, like it wasn't in any hurry. It didn't hurt exactly, but the sensation of the gears turning beneath my ribs was unsettling. What in the ever-loving, I began. But the words caught in my throat when I realized my bedroom wasn't my bedroom anymore. It wasn't even a room. I was standing in the middle of a foggy expanse, the ground beneath me made of cracked stone tiles that stretched endlessly in every direction. Floating lanterns bobbed in the air around me, casting golden light through the thick mist. In the distance, I could hear faint whispers, a susurrus of voices too soft to make out but persistent, like the hum of an approaching storm. "Welcome," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He was impossibly tall and thin, his skin the color of parchment, and his face was missing. Where his features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. Despite this, I could feel him staring at me, his presence pressing against me like a physical weight. He was dressed in a long coat made of patchwork clock faces, their hands ticking at different speeds. Hi," I said, taking a cautious step back. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, echoing rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Late for what?" I asked, my hand instinctively covering the clock embedded in my sternum. "For everything," he replied simply. "But don't worry, we'll fix that." Before I could respond, he raised a long, bony finger and pointed at the clock in my chest. The instant he did, it began to glow, the brass hands spinning wildly. My vision blurred, the mist around me swirling like a whirlpool, and I felt myself being pulled, yanked, into the clock itself. When the world stopped spinning, I was no longer in the foggy expanse. I was standing on a cobblestone street in the middle of what looked like a bustling, old-world city. Gas lamps lined the streets, their flames flickering in the evening gloom, and people in Victorian-style clothing hurried past me, their faces pale and pinched. "Excuse me," I called out to a woman in a bonnet as she bustled by. "Where am I?" She gave me a quick, startled glance but said nothing, her footsteps quickening as if my question had offended her. "Okay," I muttered. "Friendly place." The clock in my chest ticked louder, drawing my attention. I looked down to see the brass hands pointing to 12:03, though I had no idea what it meant. "That's not possible," said a voice to my left. I turned to see a boy, no older than 10, staring at me with wide, curious eyes. His clothes were patched and dirty, and he clutched a wooden toy horse in one hand. "What's not possible?" I asked. "The clock," he said, pointing at my chest. "It's not supposed to work here." "What do you mean, not supposed to work?" "It's just a clock." The boy shook his head, his expression grave. "Nothing ticks here." Before I could ask what that meant, the whispers I'd heard earlier began again, louder this time. The boy's eyes widened in fear, and he grabbed my hand. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" I demanded, but he was already pulling me down the street. his small fingers surprisingly strong. "Shadows," he said breathlessly. "We have to hide." As we ran, the gas lamps flickered and dimmed, one by one, as if the darkness itself were swallowing them. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic symphony of fragmented voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The boy dragged me into an alleyway, pressing himself against the wall. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't breathe." I followed his lead, my heart hammering in my chest, and peeked around the corner. The shadows on the street were wrong. They weren't cast by anything. They moved independently, slithering across the cobblestones like living creatures. They flickered and warped, their shapes constantly shifting, and wherever they passed, the light died. One of the shadows stopped, turning, or at least, it felt like it turned, toward our hiding spot. I held my breath, my hand clutching the boy's for dear life. The clock in my chest ticked once. The shadow darted toward us. "No!" the boy cried, but it was too late. The shadow lunged at me, and the world shattered. I found myself back in the foggy expanse, gasping for air. The tall, faceless man stood before me, his coat of clocks ticking softly. "Congratulations," he said. "You survived your first trial." "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What are those things?" "Fragments of what was lost," he said cryptically. "You'll encounter them often." "I didn't agree to this," I shouted. "Send me back." He tilted his head, as if considering my request. "Back? Oh no, there's no going back. Your clock is already ticking." As if to emphasize his point, the clock in my chest ticked louder, and the brass hands shifted again, pointing to a new time. 3:47. "What happens when it runs out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His featureless face seemed to smile, though no mouth appeared. "That's for you to find out." Before I could argue, the world shifted again, pulling me into another reality. This time, I landed in a forest bathed in twilight, the air thick with the scent of earth and pine. The trees around me whispered in a language I couldn't understand, their branches moving like grasping fingers. The clock in my chest ticked on, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the whispers start again. "So, here's my question. If you woke up with a clock in your chest that pulled you into strange, otherworldly trials every time it ticked, what do you think it would reveal about you? And more importantly, would you let it run out?" The first time I met Rowan, I thought they were a ghost. It was late, one of those damp, foggy nights where the streetlights look like smudged halos in the dark. I had just moved into this old, creaky apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls seem to sigh when you're not looking. I was halfway up the stairs with a box of books when I saw someone standing in the dim hallway outside my door. They were tall, pale, and dressed in a long gray coat that billowed slightly, even though there wasn't any wind. Their hair was wild, like they just stepped out of a storm, and they were staring at the wall, motionless, like they were trying to remember something they'd forgotten centuries ago. I froze. My brain, already fried from unpacking and the eerie vibes of the building, immediately jumped to paranormal entity. I was 2 seconds away from hurling my box of books at them when they turned, blinked, and said, "Oh, you're real. That's unexpected." What?" I managed to sputter, clutching my box like a shield. They tilted their head, studying me with an unsettling calm. "You're new here," they said, like they just solved a mystery. Then, without another word, they turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a solid minute, wondering if I should move out immediately, before finally shuffling into my apartment and locking the door behind me. The whole thing felt like the setup to a horror movie. I decided not to tell anyone because, frankly, I didn't want to be the main character in a story that ended with me being haunted. For a while, I tried to avoid them. I'd take the stairs if I thought they might be in the elevator, and I'd peek through the peephole before leaving my apartment. But Rowan, it seemed, had other plans. One morning, as I was juggling coffee and a stack of papers, I stepped out of my door and almost collided with them. They were sitting on the floor in the hallway, cross-legged and barefoot, flipping through a thick, weathered notebook. "You're blocking the way," I said, trying not to spill my coffee. "You're in a rush," they replied without looking up. Why? I blinked, unsure how to respond. Because work? They finally looked at me, their gray eyes sharp and curious. You don't seem like someone who's very good at pretending to care about work. I stared at them, equal parts confused and annoyed, before stepping over them and heading down the stairs. From behind me, I heard them call out, "You should try stopping sometime. Rushing makes you miss things." Over the next few weeks, Rowan kept showing up in strange places, sitting on the steps, lounging on the roof, perched on the edge of the laundry machines in the basement. They had a knack for appearing when I least expected it, always with some offbeat comment or cryptic observation that left me wondering if they were messing with me or genuinely seeing the world on a completely different wavelength. One night, I found them in the building's tiny courtyard, lying flat on their back on the damp grass, staring at the stars. It was late, and I was exhausted, but something about the scene pulled me in. I walked over, hesitating, before finally asking, "What are you doing?" "Listening," they said simply. "To what?" "The stars," they replied, as if it were obvious. I almost laughed but stopped myself. Instead, I sat down, awkwardly hugging my knees. "What are they saying?" I asked, mostly to humor them. Rowan turned their head to look at me, their expression soft but serious. "They're saying you spend too much time worrying about things that don't matter." That caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Instead, I sat there, letting the silence settle between us. For the first time in a long time, I felt still. After that, Rowan became less of an enigma and more of a presence in my life. They'd knock on my door at odd hours with strange requests, like borrowing a flashlight to chase the shadows, or asking if I wanted to go find the edges of the night. Sometimes, I'd join them, and we'd end up wandering through empty streets or sitting on the roof, talking about everything and nothing. Rowan had this way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. A crack in the sidewalk wasn't just a crack, it was a map of the world's fractures. The wind wasn't just weather, it was the earth's quiet way of speaking. They were endlessly curious, endlessly alive, and being around them felt like stepping into a story where anything was possible. One night, as we sat on the roof sharing a bag of gummy bears, I asked, "Why do you do all this?" The wandering, the weird observations, I gestured vaguely. "Everything?" They chewed on a gummy bear thoughtfully before answering. "Most people sleepwalk through life," they said. "They move fast, but they don't see. I don't want to miss it." "Miss what?" "The wonder," they said simply. It sounded like something out of a philosophy textbook, but the way they said it made me believe them. Over time, Rowan became my closest friend, though friend doesn't quite feel like the right word. They were more like a force of nature, unpredictable and magnetic. They pushed me to do things I never thought I'd do, like climbing a fire escape at dawn just to see the city wake up, or walking into a storm because rain deserves an audience. They made me feel brave, even when I wasn't. The last time I saw Rowan, they left me a note tucked under my door. It was written on a scrap of paper, their handwriting messy and looping. It said, "I'm chasing the edges again. Don't forget to stop and listen sometimes." The stars still have things to say. I don't know where they went, and honestly, I'm not sure they even knew. But I think about them often, especially on quiet nights when the world feels big and mysterious and full of possibilities. Have you ever met someone who turned your world upside down in the best way? I was walking home late after a long day at work, the kind of day that felt stretched too thin, like an overused rubber band. The street was quiet, save for the soft hum of street lamps and the occasional bark of a faraway dog. I passed the same alley I always did, a short, unremarkable detour between two rows of brownstones, when I noticed something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Just above the ground, in the middle of the alley, hung a faint line of light, glowing softly like a firefly trapped in a jar. It was barely the length of a forearm, wavering as though caught in an invisible breeze. I stopped, stared. Blinking did nothing. It was still there, hanging midair as impossible as a crack in glass. I edged closer, my footsteps sounding too loud on the pavement. I had no explanation, no frame of reference for what I was seeing. It was as if someone had ripped the fabric of the world and left this thin, shimmering wound behind. It wasn't bright. It was the kind of light that seemed to drink up the darkness around it. I don't know what possessed me to reach out, but I did. My hand hovered near the tear, the skin on my fingertips tingling as if I were holding them close to an electric current. For a moment, I hesitated, and then I pushed through. The world broke apart. It didn't shatter or explode. It unraveled, like someone had pulled a single thread, and everything fell away in slow motion. I stumbled forward, expecting to hit the concrete of the alley, but instead, I landed on something soft and cold. Snow. When I looked up, I was no longer in the city. I was standing in the middle of a vast, endless forest blanketed in silver snow. The trees, tall, impossibly tall, stretched so high their tops disappeared into a hazy, starless sky. The snow beneath my feet shimmered faintly, not like normal snow, but as if it were laced with glittering embers. The air smelled of pine and something else, something sharp and metallic, like the edge of a knife. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, not even the soft crunch of my boots as I took a step. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. A soft hum broke the quiet. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but a vibration, a thrumming in my chest that I felt rather than heard. I turned, and that's when I saw them. Figures. They were moving slowly through the trees, just silhouettes at first, but as they drew closer, I saw their details. They weren't people, not quite. They were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid. Their skin was pale and glowed faintly, like moonlight reflected on water. Their eyes, those were the worst part, were dark and deep, pools of ink that seemed to stretch forever. They didn't seem to walk so much as glide, their feet barely touching the ground. They carried lanterns, tiny glass orbs filled with swirling light that flickered and danced, casting rippling shadows on the snow. I froze, not daring to breathe. My instinct screamed at me to run, but where would I go? There was nothing but trees and snow and more trees stretching endlessly into the distance. One of the figures stopped. It turned its head, slowly, impossibly slowly, and its gaze fixed on me. Even from across the clearing, I could feel it, like cold fingers pressing against my ribs. The others stopped too, their heads swiveling in perfect unison until every single one of them was looking at me. My breath fogged in the air, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the figure closest to me raised its lantern. The swirling light inside it flared, and the snow at its feet melted instantly, revealing something beneath the surface. A stone path, black and glistening like obsidian, cut straight through the forest, leading toward a distant, glowing shape on the horizon. The figure pointed down the path with one long, bony finger, its face expressionless. I swallowed hard. "You want me to go that way?" It didn't answer. None of them did. They just watched, unmoving, their lanterns swaying gently in some unseen breeze. I took a step onto the path. The stone was warm, almost alive, and pulsed faintly beneath my feet. As soon as I set foot on it, the figures moved again, this time melting back into the trees, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the dark. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange there, slippery and unreliable. The sky never changed, and the snow fell softly around me in a constant, dreamlike haze. Eventually, the path ended at a bridge. It was ancient-looking, made of blackened wood and lined with iron railings that curled into intricate shapes, some of which looked unsettlingly like faces. Beyond the bridge stood a door. The door didn't belong there. It was tall, twice my height, and made of polished mahogany, completely out of place in the frozen wilderness. Its surface was carved with swirling patterns that shifted when I looked at them, twisting into images of things I couldn't quite name. Hesitating, I placed my hand on the handle. It was warm, just like the path. Before I could think too hard, I pulled the door open and stepped through. The world on the other side wasn't snow or forest. It was a room, a massive, circular room lined with countless mirrors stretching from floor to ceiling. Each mirror reflected a different version of me, not as I was, but as I could have been. In one, I was wearing a tattered cloak, holding a sword that gleamed with fire. In another, I was sitting on a throne made of bones. In another, I was laughing in a city bathed in golden light. The mirrors hummed softly, like they were whispering secrets to one another. Choose. The voice was soft, but it echoed through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Choose what? I asked, my voice sounding small in the cavernous space. Choose the version of yourself you wish to become. I turned in a slow circle, my heart pounding as I looked at the endless reflections. Some were beautiful, some were terrifying. All of them felt real. What happens if I choose wrong? There is no wrong, the voice replied. Only choice. I stared into one mirror, then another, my thoughts racing. I didn't know how long I stood there, torn between the possibilities. Finally, I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached toward one of the mirrors. The glass rippled like water, and as my fingers touched the surface, the world tilted. I woke up in my bed, the morning light streaming through the window, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better, because when I glanced at my reflection in the mirror across the room, the person staring back wasn't quite the same. There was something sharper in my gaze, something older and stranger, and in my hand was a single shard of obsidian, still warm to the touch. Have you ever felt like reality itself was holding its breath, waiting for you to decide who you wanted to be?